The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of the Patent Armor Museum at Fort Knox, casting long shadows across polished concrete floors. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the air and glinted off the hulking metal beasts that stood in silent formation throughout the cavernous space. Among these mechanical warriors of a bygone era, a particular olive-drab Sherman tank commanded attention not for its size or firepower, but for the man who stood before it. Robert Steel Bob Callahan stood ramrod straight despite his 75 years. His weathered hands rested on the shoulders of his 12-year-old grandson, Michael, as they gazed up at the restored M4 Sherman. Unlike the other visitors who moved quickly from exhibit to exhibit, snapping photos and barely reading plaques, Callahan stood perfectly still, his pale blue eyes fixed on the tank with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something far beyond the physical machine before him. "This one," he said softly, his voice a gravelly rumble that carried the weight of decades. "This one looks just like my old girl." Michael glanced up at his grandfather, noting the unusual emotion in the old man's typically stoic face. Callahan was not a man who displayed his feelings readily. A retired Army colonel with combat experience across multiple conflicts, he had always been the family's pillar of quiet strength and measured wisdom. But today, standing before this particular Sherman, something had shifted. "Can I go inside it?" Michael asked, eager to climb the metal beast. Callahan shook his head slowly. "No one goes inside this one anymore, son, but I can tell you exactly what it looks like in there, every inch, every gauge, every switch." He paused, his calloused hand reaching out to touch the cold steel of the hull. "Spent more time in one of these than I did in my own bed back in 4 A museum docent approached, a younger veteran in his 50s wearing a name tag that identified him as Doug and sporting a 3rd Armored Division pin on his lapel. He nodded respectfully to Callahan, recognizing the bearing of a fellow soldier. "She's a beauty, isn't she? M4A3E8, fully restored to operational condition," the docent said. "We call her Easy 8. "I know what she is," Callahan replied without taking his eyes off the tank. There was no rudeness in his tone, only a profound familiarity that needed no explanation between soldiers. "3rd Armored?" he asked, nodding at the man's pin. "Yes, sir, Desert Storm." "Good outfit," Callahan nodded. "I was with them in Europe, different war." The docent's eyes widened slightly as he recalculated the age and experience of the man before him. "World War II? You drove one of these?" "Commanded one," Callahan corrected gently. "Charlie Company, 33rd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division." He recited the designation with the ease of a man stating his own name. "Normandy through Germany." The docent stepped back, offering a subtle nod that communicated deep respect. "Sir, it would be an honor to hear any stories you'd care to share about your experience. We're always looking to enrich our historical records with first-hand accounts." Michael looked up at his grandfather expectantly. In all their time together, Grandpa Bob had told countless stories about baseball games, fishing trips, and even his time training recruits after the war. But he rarely spoke about his combat experiences, especially those early days in Europe. The boy had learned through family whispers that some memories were too heavy to share. "Perhaps another time," Callahan said to the docent. But as the man nodded and moved away to assist other visitors, the old soldier's hand remained on the Sherman's hull, as though reluctant to break physical contact with this piece of his past. Michael's eyes tracked to a nearby information display. "Grandpa, it says here that some soldiers call these Ronson lighters or death traps. Is that true? Were they that bad?" Something flashed in Callahan's eyes then, a mix of indignation and old pain. He turned fully to his grandson, his hand finally leaving the tank's surface. "Books and displays can tell you facts and figures, Michael. They can tell you armor thickness and penetration statistics. They can tell you how many were built and how many were lost." His voice dropped lower, causing Michael to lean in. "But they can't tell you what it was like to live in one of these, to fight in one, to lose friends in one, and to ultimately win a war in one." He looked back at the Sherman, his expression softening. "People who weren't there like to simplify things, call them death traps or miracle machines. The truth is always more complicated." A rare smile crossed his face. "How about this? Instead of repeating what the display says, would you like to hear what really happened?" Michael's eyes widened. "You mean you'll actually tell me about the war? About your tank?" Callahan nodded slowly. "Some of it, anyway. There's a story I've never told anyone in the family. Not even your grandmother knew all of it." He guided his grandson to a bench positioned with a view of the Sherman. It's about time someone heard it, I suppose. And you're old enough now. As they settled onto the bench, Callahan took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the Sherman. It begins in July 1944, about a month after D-Day. I was 29 years old, a former math teacher from Chicago who'd been in the Army for 3 years by then. We'd just fought our way through the hedgerows around a town called St. Lo. Chapter 2, Normandy, July 1904. The rain had finally stopped, but the Norman countryside remained a treacherous quagmire of mud and shattered vegetation. Captain Robert Callahan stood atop the turret of his Sherman tank, binoculars trained on the tree line 300 yards ahead. His uniform was stiff with dried mud and sweat, his face darkened by a week's growth of beard and the fine dust of combat that seemed to work its way into every pore. The air smelled of wet earth, diesel exhaust, and something else more insidious. A smell that after weeks in Normandy had become as familiar as coffee in the morning. The lingering scent of death and cordite that hung over every battlefield like a shroud. "See anything, Cap?" Frank Peterson called up from the driver's hatch. At 44, the former Detroit auto mechanic was the oldest man in the crew, a fact he never let the younger men forget. His large hands, permanently stained with engine oil despite vigorous scrubbing, gripped the edge of his hatch as he squinted into the distance. "Nothing moving," Callahan replied, lowering his binoculars and rubbing eyes gritty from lack of sleep. "But that doesn't mean they're not there." Charlie Company had been reduced from 16 tanks to 9 in the brutal fighting around St. Lo. 7 crews wiped out in 3 days of combat, 19 men dead, another dozen wounded badly enough to be evacuated. The replacement tanks and crews hadn't arrived yet, leaving the company dangerously under strength as they pushed eastward toward the strategic crossroads at Marigny. Callahan dropped down into the turret, the familiar confines of the Sherman, simultaneously claustrophobic and oddly comforting. This metal box had been home for months now, every inch of it known intimately to him and his crew. The space smelled of sweat, gun oil, and the canned rations they'd been subsisting on for days. "What's the word, sir?" asked Sergeant Mike O'Malley, the gunner. At 32, O'Malley was a former Chicago police officer who had brought his marksman skills to the 76mm cannon. His square Irish face was set in its perpetual expression of wary readiness, blue eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead through his periscope. "Battalion wants us to probe forward to that next village," Callahan said, unfolding his map across the radio unit. "We'll take point with 2nd Platoon spread out behind us. 3rd Platoon stays in reserve." "So we're the ones who get shot at first, again," said Timothy Barnes from the radio operator's position. At 19, Barnes was the youngest of the crew, a brilliant MIT physics student who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor instead of accepting his college deferment. Despite his youth, his expertise with the tank's electrical systems had saved them more than once. "That's what taking point means, college boy," Johnny Rodriguez, the loader, said, with a grin that flashed white in his dust-covered face. The 21-year-old New Mexico native had the unenviable job of manhandling the heavy 76mm shells into the breech of the main gun. His powerful arms and quick reflexes had proven invaluable in the heat of battle. "Cut the chatter," Callahan ordered, though without real heat. After months together, the 5 men functioned less as a military unit and more as a family, albeit one with a strict hierarchy. "Peterson, start her up. Let's move out." The Sherman's 4 GAA engine roared to life, its 500 horsepower sending vibrations through the tank's frame. Peterson eased the 30-ton vehicle forward, its tracks churning through the mud as they led the diminished company toward their objective. Callahan stood in the commander's cupola, head and shoulders exposed above the turret to maintain better visibility. It was a calculated risk. German snipers were always hunting for tank commanders, but the limited vision through the periscopes made effective command nearly impossible in complex terrain. The hedgerow country of Normandy was a tanker's nightmare. The ancient earthen embankments topped with dense vegetation created natural fortifications that had turned the expected rapid advance from the beaches into a grueling slog measured in yards rather than miles. Each field was a potential ambush site, each road junction a killing zone. The column of Shermans moved cautiously, maintaining proper spacing to minimize the effect of artillery or air attacks. Callahan's tank, which the crew had named Warhound, led the formation through the muddy track that passed for a road in this part of France. "Movement! 2 o'clock, O'Malley called out sharply. "Behind that stone wall." Callahan swung his binoculars to the position. "I see them. Infantry, our guys, Baker Company." He reached for the radio. Baker 6, this is Charlie 1 approaching from your south. Hold your fire. The radio crackled with a terse acknowledgement as the infantry commander recognized their approach. As Warhound drew closer, Callahan could see the exhaustion in the faces of the infantry soldiers who had been holding this position for 2 days under sporadic artillery fire. A lieutenant detached himself from the group and approached the tank as Peterson brought it to a halt. The man looked impossibly young and impossibly old simultaneously, his fresh face already showing the strain of command in combat. Captain Callahan? Lieutenant Parker, Baker Company. Glad to see you boys. Callahan nodded. What's the situation ahead? Germans pulled back from the village last night. Left some nasty surprises behind, though. Lost 2 men to booby traps this morning. We've been watching from here, but they're definitely gone now. Probably regrouping at Marigny. Any armor? Parker shook his head. Not here, but prisoners say they've got Tigers with the 2nd SS Panzer somewhere east of here. The mention of Tiger tanks sent a subtle tension through Callahan's frame. The German heavy tanks outclassed the Sherman in virtually every category that mattered in tank versus tank combat. Thanks for the intel. We'll take it from here, Callahan said, signaling Peterson to move forward again. As the tanks rumbled past the infantry positions, the foot soldiers offered weary waves and called out encouragement. The relationship between infantry and armor was complex. Tanks provided crucial fire support, but also drew enemy anti-tank fire that endangered nearby infantry. Still, no soldier ever complained about having tanks on their side when the alternative was facing the enemy without them. They approached the abandoned village cautiously, alert for the anti-tank mines and Panzerfaust teams that had claimed so many Shermans in the hedgerow fighting. The first building showed the scars of recent combat, walls pockmarked with bullet holes, and several structures partially collapsed from artillery strikes. Peterson, hold here, Callahan ordered as they reached the village edge. He surveyed the main street through his binoculars, looking for telltale signs of ambush. O'Malley, keep your eye on that church steeple. Perfect spot for an observer. Callahan was reaching for his radio to coordinate with the other tanks when the battalion frequency came alive with an unexpected message. All Charlie elements, this is battalion. Hold position. Captain Callahan to report to Battalion CP immediately. Send your XO forward to assume command. Over. Callahan frowned. Being pulled from the line during an advance was unusual. Roger, battalion. On my way. Charlie 1 out. He turned to his second in command in the next tank over. Lieutenant Ross, take command until I return. Standard defensive perimeter around the village. No unnecessary risks. The jeep ride back to the battalion command post took 20 minutes over rutted, muddy roads. Each jolt sent pain through Callahan's back, a reminder of the physical toll that living in a tank exacted on the human body. The battalion CP had been established in a partially damaged French farmhouse, the yard filled with communication vehicles and the perimeter secured by grim-faced MPs. Inside, the farmhouse had been transformed into a military nerve center. Maps covered tables, radios crackled with frontline reports, and staff officers moved purposefully between stations, updating unit positions and coordinating logistics. Colonel Harris, the battalion commander, stood over the main map table, his face set in the permanent frown that had become his standard expression since D-Day. Captain Callahan reporting as ordered, sir, Callahan said, rendering a crisp salute despite his filthy uniform. Colonel Harris returned the salute. At ease, Bob. Follow me. The use of his first name caught Callahan by surprise. Harris was typically formal, especially in the CP. The colonel led him to a small room at the back of the farmhouse that had been requisitioned as a private office. Inside, rather than the expected battalion staff, Callahan found a single officer he didn't recognize seated at a small table. The man wore the oak leaf of a lieutenant colonel, but had no unit insignia visible on his uniform. Captain Callahan, this is Lieutenant Colonel William Abrams from Army Ordnance Research, Harris said. He's here from SHAEF headquarters. I'll leave you two to talk. Harris departed, closing the door behind him with a finality that suggested to Callahan that something significant was about to happen. Abrams was a lean man in his 40s with penetrating eyes and the air of someone who spent more time thinking than sleeping. He gestured to the chair across from him. Please, Captain, have a seat. I apologize for pulling you from your unit during operations, but this matter couldn't wait. Callahan sat, his curiosity overcoming his natural caution. What's this about, Colonel? What I'm about to tell you is classified, Abrams began, folding his hands on the table. I understand your company has seen heavy action since landing. Yes, sir. We're down to 9 tanks from our original 16. Abrams nodded. And how many of those losses would you attribute to enemy armor versus other causes? The question seemed loaded somehow, but Callahan answered truthfully. 5 were knocked out by enemy tanks, mostly Panthers, 1 to an 88 anti-tank gun. The last was a mechanical breakdown that had to be abandoned during a withdrawal. And of the 5 hit by enemy tanks, how many brewed up? The euphemism for catastrophic fires that consumed tanks and often their crews made Callahan's jaw tighten. 4 caught fire immediately. We managed to get most of the crews out, but he let the sentence hang, unwilling to revisit the details of burned men screaming inside metal coffins. Abrams nodded soberly. That tracks with our wider statistics. Approximately 60 to 70% of Sherman losses are complicated by ammunition fires. Permission to speak freely, sir. Please do. We call them Ronson lighters for a reason. The ammunition storage is unprotected, and the gasoline engine might as well be filled with napalm. The main gun can't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor, even at point-blank range. We're fighting the best tanks in the world with equipment that's fundamentally outmatched. The frustration of weeks of watching good men die in burning Shermans edged into Callahan's voice. Rather than taking offense, Abrams nodded. Your assessment matches what we're hearing from other combat commanders. The Sherman was designed and rushed into production before we fully understood what we'd be facing in Europe. By the time we encountered Tigers and Panthers in North Africa and Italy, we had thousands of Shermans already built or in the pipeline. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it. The problem is time and logistics. We have a new tank design that could match or exceed German armor, the T-26 Pershing, but it won't be ready for deployment in significant numbers until early next year. In the meantime, we've been working on improving the Sherman. Abrams pushed several photographs across the table. They showed Sherman tanks that looked subtly different from the ones Callahan commanded. This is where you come in, Captain. I'm heading a special project codenamed Thunderbolt to field test improved Sherman variants under actual combat conditions. Based on your combat record and your background in mathematics and engineering, you've been selected to participate. Callahan studied the photographs. These have the new 76mm gun. We've seen a few of those coming into the replacement pipeline. Yes, but these modifications go beyond the gun. Improved ammunition storage, additional armor welded to vulnerable points, and most importantly, this one, he tapped a particular photograph, has a new suspension system and higher velocity cannon. We call it the Easy 8. Initial testing suggests it can penetrate a Panther's armor at combat ranges. Callahan looked up from the photos. With all due respect, sir, why are you telling me this? Surely there are higher-ranking officers better positioned to evaluate new equipment. Abrams leaned forward. Because I need someone who has been in the fight, who has lost men in tanks, and who will give me honest assessments rather than what they think Ordnance Branch wants to hear. I need detailed reports on how these improvements perform under actual combat conditions. And my company will receive these improved tanks? Some of them. We can't replace all your vehicles at once without drawing attention to the program. You'll get 2 standard Sherman 76mm tanks immediately as normal replacements. Within 2 weeks, you'll receive 2 of the Easy 8s. The rest of your company will continue with their current tanks for now. The implication was clear. Some crews would get better protection and firepower, while others would continue to risk their lives in the more vulnerable standard Shermans. Callahan would have to decide who lived and who died. I don't like playing favorites with my men's lives, Colonel. None of us do, Captain, but the alternative is sending everyone into battle with inadequate equipment while we wait for perfect solutions that won't arrive in time to matter. Abrams' voice was level, but carried the weight of difficult decisions already made. Your reports and experiences will help us refine these improvements so they can be implemented across the entire Sherman fleet as quickly as possible. Callahan was silent for a long moment, weighing his duty to his immediate command against the broader implications for the armored forces as a whole. There's something else, Abrams said, breaking the silence. Intelligence reports indicate that a new SS Panzer division is moving into your sector, equipped with King Tiger tanks. Callahan felt his blood run cold. The King Tiger, or Tiger II, was the most formidable tank on any battlefield, with frontal armor so thick that virtually no Allied tank gun could penetrate it. Its 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman from distances beyond the effective range of the Sherman's own weapons. When? Within the week, according to our latest intelligence. That's why we're accelerating the Thunderbolt program in your sector. Your company is likely to be among the first to encounter these new German heavy tanks. Callahan leaned back in his chair, or the weight of the responsibility settling onto his shoulders. I'll do it, he said finally. But I want your word that if these modifications prove effective, they'll be implemented as widely and quickly as possible. You have it, Abrams said, extending his hand. The data you provide could save thousands of lives, Captain. As they shook hands, Callahan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a deal with consequences that would extend far beyond his own company or even the current campaign. He was now responsible not only for his men's lives in the immediate future, but potentially for the survival of countless tank crews across the European theater. When do we start? He asked. Your replacement tanks are already on their way to your company position. I'll arrange transport to get you back to your men immediately. Abrams gathered the photographs and returned them to his folder. One more thing, Captain. The specific details of Project Thunderbolt remain classified. Your men should know they're receiving newer equipment with improvements, but the full scope of the testing program should remain between us. Understood, sir. As Callahan left the farmhouse to return to his company, the weight of command felt heavier than ever before. The knowledge that his men would soon face the most powerful tanks in the German arsenal with machines that might not be up to the challenge gnawed at him. Yet there was also a glimmer of hope in the promised improvements, if they arrived in time and performed as expected. The Jeep bounced along the muddy road back to the front, each jolt a reminder of the harsh realities that no amount of planning or technology could fully mitigate. War was ultimately about men, not machines, Callahan reminded himself, and his men were among the best. Chapter 3, The Fateful Meeting. When Callahan returned to the company position, he found his tanks established in a defensive perimeter around the village, just as he had ordered. Lieutenant Ross had positioned the vehicles effectively, using the stone buildings for additional cover, while maintaining clear fields of fire along likely avenues of approach. The two replacement Shermans had already arrived, their fresh olive-drab paint standing out against the mud, spattered, battle-worn appearance of the surviving tanks. Maintenance crews swarmed over them, preparing them for combat. Callahan noticed immediately that both were equipped with the newer 76mm gun rather than the original 75mm, a small but significant improvement in anti-tank capability. Good to have you back, sir, Lieutenant Ross said, approaching with a clipboard of requisition forms and situation reports. These new tracks arrived about an hour ago. Crews are transferring personal gear and ammunition now. Any contact while I was gone? Callahan asked, scanning the distant tree line habitually. Negative. A few rounds of harassing artillery about 2 miles east, but nothing in our immediate area. Battalion S2 thinks the Germans are consolidating at the next phase line. Callahan nodded. Good work on the positioning. I'm going to check on the new tanks. Keep the current watch rotation for now. As he approached the replacement Shermans, Callahan spotted Frank Peterson, circling one of them with the critical eye of a veteran mechanic. What do you think, Frank? Callahan asked. Peterson ran a hand along the hull of the new tank. Newer model, better transmission, thank God. The 76 has a bit more kick against armor, but the turret's more cramped to accommodate it. He lowered his voice. Still got the same thin skin, though, and still runs on gasoline. Callahan nodded. The vulnerabilities that had earned the Sherman its grim nicknames remain largely unaddressed in these replacements. These are just the first step, he said carefully, mindful of Abrams' instructions about discretion. There are more improvements coming. Peterson gave him a skeptical look, but knew better than to press for details. I'll believe it when I see it, Cap. Meanwhile, we'll make do with what we've got, same as always. Callahan spent the next hour inspecting both new tanks and assigning them to the crews whose vehicles had been destroyed in the recent fighting. The selection process was straightforward, based on crew experience and position in the company structure, but it still felt like playing God, deciding who would have slightly better odds of survival in the coming battles. As evening approached, Callahan called his platoon leaders and senior NCOs together for a briefing in the relative shelter of a damaged farm building that had been appropriated as a temporary command post. Maps were spread across an old wooden table, illuminated by battery-powered lamps as the natural light faded. Battalion expects the Germans to make a stand at Marigny, Callahan began, indicating the town on the map. Latest intelligence suggests elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division are reinforcing the sector. That means Panthers, possibly Tigers. The mention of German heavy tanks sent a ripple of tension through the gathered men. Everyone present had seen what those armored behemoths could do to a Sherman. Additionally, Callahan continued, weighing each word carefully, there are reports of a new German heavy tank being deployed to this sector, the King Tiger. He let that sink in before continuing. It's essentially an upgraded Tiger with even thicker armor and the same 88mm gun. Jesus, muttered Sergeant Wallace, a veteran platoon sergeant who had been with the company since North Africa. How the hell are we supposed to fight something like that? It was the question on everyone's mind, and Callahan had been wrestling with it himself since his meeting with Abrams. The same way we've been fighting everything else the Germans throw at us, Callahan said firmly, with tactics, teamwork, and determination. The King Tiger has weaknesses like any other machine. It's slow, heavy, mechanically unreliable, and has poor visibility. Its side and rear armor are more vulnerable than the front. He traced a finger along the map. Tomorrow we advance to this ridgeline, which gives us good observation of the approaches to Marini. I want to avoid direct tank versus tank engagements where possible. We'll coordinate with artillery and air support to engage any armor we encounter. After covering the operational details for the next day's movement, Callahan dismissed the group but asked Lieutenant Ross to remain behind. John, you and I need to have a frank discussion about our tactical approach, Callahan said once they were alone. The standard doctrine for Sherman employment isn't going to cut it against what we're facing. Ross, a career military man who had been commissioned from the ranks before the war, leaned over the map. What are you thinking, sir? We need to leverage our advantages. Shermans are faster and more mechanically reliable than German heavy tanks. We have more of them, and our crews are better trained in cooperative tactics. Callahan began sketching on a notepad. I'm thinking about a modified wolfpack approach. Instead of engaging heavy armor individually, we concentrate fire from multiple tanks, preferably from different angles to force the enemy to divide their attention. Ross studied the diagram Callahan had drawn. Hit and run, strike from the flanks, then reposition before they can bring their big guns to bear? Exactly. The King Tiger is a fortress from the front, but it can't be strong everywhere. It's also terrible in close terrain where its size and limited turret traverse speed become liabilities. We'll use the landscape to dictate the terms of engagement whenever possible. The two officers spent another hour refining the tactical approach, discussing how to train the other tank commanders quickly in the new methods. When they finally emerged from the command post, the night had fully descended, with only the distant rumble of artillery to the east disturbing the relative quiet. Callahan made his way to his tank, where the crew had established their evening routine. Rodriguez was heating sea rations over a small stove, while O'Malley cleaned the coaxial machine gun with methodical precision. Barnes sat cross-legged on the tank's rear deck, writing a letter by flashlight, while Peterson performed his nightly maintenance checks on the engine. Evening, gentlemen, Callahan said as he approached. Chow's almost ready, Cap, Rodriguez reported. It's ham and lima beans, again. My favorite, Callahan lied with a straight face, prompting good-natured groans from the men who had heard the same joke dozens of times before. As they ate their unappetizing but necessary meal, Callahan observed his crew. These men had become more than subordinates. They were a family forged in the crucible of combat. He knew their strengths and weaknesses, their fears and hopes. Peterson with his 3 children back in Detroit, one of whom he had never seen in person. O'Malley and his fiancée waiting in Chicago. Rodriguez supporting his widowed mother and 3 sisters in New Mexico. Barnes, the brilliant youngster who had given up MIT to fight fascism. How many of them would survive the coming encounters with the most formidable armored vehicles ever deployed on a battlefield? The knowledge that he would soon receive improved tanks for some crews but not others weighed heavily on Callahan. The cold equations of war demanded that resources be allocated where they would do the most good, but those equations were paid for in blood. Something on your mind, Cap? Peterson asked, his experienced eyes catching Callahan's preoccupation. Just planning for tomorrow, Callahan replied, forcing a confident expression, and thinking about the new tanks we're expecting. These replacements are a good start, Peterson said, nodding toward the new arrivals. That 76 gives us a fighting chance against a Panther, at least if we can hit it in the right spot. There's more coming, Callahan said carefully. Some significant improvements. But I need all of you to focus on our immediate situation. We adapt and overcome with what we have, not what we wish we had. The men nodded their understanding. It was a philosophy they had lived by since landing in France. Later, as the others bedded down for a few precious hours of sleep, Callahan sat alone on the turret of the Warhound, staring at the stars visible through breaks in the cloud cover. The weight of command felt particularly heavy tonight, knowing what was coming their way and understanding the limitations of the tools they had to face it. His mind returned to the photographs Abrams had shown him, particularly the Easy 8 variant. If it performed as promised, it could shift the balance significantly. But would it arrive in time? And how would he choose which crews received the better protection and firepower? The distant rumble of artillery grew more persistent, a reminder that the war continued without pause, indifferent to the concerns of one tank company commander. Tomorrow they would advance again, pushing deeper into enemy territory with their mismatched collection of tanks, relying on skill and determination to overcome technological disadvantages. As Callahan finally prepared to get some rest, he made a silent promise to himself and to the men under his command. He would do everything in his power to bring as many of them home as possible, using every tactical advantage and improvement available. The Germans might have superior tanks, but they would learn that American tankers were not to be underestimated. Chapter 4. The Steel Threat. Dawn broke over Normandy with a misty rain that reduced visibility and turned the already difficult terrain into a quagmire. Callahan stood with his platoon leaders on a small rise, studying the ground they would have to cover that day through binoculars. "It's going to slow us down," Lieutenant Ross observed, gesturing toward the sodden fields and muddy tracks that passed for roads. "The new advance timeline from battalion may be optimistic." "We'll adapt," Callahan replied. "The mud affects the Germans too, maybe more so. Their heavy tanks have narrower tracks and higher ground pressure. They'll struggle in this." It was a small consolation, but in warfare, any advantage, however slight, could be the difference between victory and defeat. Before returning to their vehicles, Callahan gathered his tank commanders for a final briefing on the new tactical approach he and Ross had developed overnight. The men listened intently as he explained the modified Wolfpack tactics. "We can't match them tank for tank in a straight-up fight," Callahan concluded, "but we can outmaneuver them, concentrate our firepower, and strike where they're vulnerable. No lone heroes, no charging in without support. We work together or we die separately." By 0700 hours, Charlie Company was mounted up and moving out, advancing in an extended formation that maximized their ability to provide mutual support while minimizing their vulnerability to artillery or air attack. Callahan's Warhound led the center section, with the two platoons spread out to either flank. The going was slow, with the tanks occasionally having to detour around particularly boggy stretches where even their wide tracks might bog down. The infantry companies that they were supporting advanced behind them, using the tanks as shields against potential machine gun positions. By mid-morning, they had covered barely 2 miles. The ridgeline that was their immediate objective loomed ahead, its gentle slope deceptively innocent-looking. But Callahan knew that the Germans were masters at using terrain for defense. The ridge would give them excellent observation over the surrounding countryside. "All elements, hold position," he ordered over the radio. "Warhound will advance with Able 3 to reconnoiter the ridge. The rest of you provide overwatch." With one of the newer 76mm Shermans accompanying him, Callahan directed Peterson to advance toward the ridge. They moved cautiously, using the scattered hedgerows for concealment where possible. "Movement on the ridge," O'Malley reported tensely from his gunner's position. 2 o'clock just below the crest line. Callahan raised his binoculars. Through the light mist, he could make out the unmistakable silhouette of an armored vehicle moving laterally along the ridge. Its low profile and distinctive mantelet identified it immediately. "Panther," he said grimly. "Range approximately 900 yards. The German Panther tank was one of the most formidable opponents they could face. Its sloped armor made it highly resistant to frontal attacks, and its long 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor at ranges exceeding a mile. Callahan quickly assessed the situation. At this range, the Panther hadn't spotted them yet, using the ridge for cover as it repositioned. It presented its side aspect momentarily, the most vulnerable angle for any tank. "O'Malley, target the Panther, flank shot. Rodriguez, APCR round." Rodriguez swiftly loaded one of their precious armor-piercing composite rigid rounds, specially designed for penetrating heavy armor. "Up," he called as the breach closed. "On the way," O'Malley replied calmly, squeezing the trigger. The Sherman rocked backward as the 76mm gun fired. Through his binoculars, Callahan watched the round strike the Panther's side armor just behind the turret ring, one of the few points where the armor was thin enough for a guaranteed penetration. The German tank shuddered to a halt, a small fire erupting from the engine compartment. Seconds later, the turret hatches flew open and the crew began to bail out. Before they could escape, machine gun fire from the accompanying Sherman cut them down. "Target destroyed," Callahan reported over the company net. "But there will be more." That was an advance element, probably reconnaissance. As if to confirm his assessment, artillery fire began to rain down on the fields behind them, indicating that German observers had spotted their position. Callahan ordered an immediate advance to the ridge to deny the Germans the advantageous terrain. The company surged forward, moving as rapidly as the muddy ground would allow. They reached the ridge and secured it without further tank contact, though sporadic artillery continued to fall behind them. From the ridge, they had an excellent view of the next phase of their advance, a shallow valley with a small village nestled at its center. The terrain was more open than the hedgerow country they had been fighting through, which would allow for better maneuverability, but also leave them more exposed. As Callahan studied the ground through his binoculars, a runner from battalion headquarters arrived with sealed orders. The young lieutenant who delivered them was visibly tense. "Sir, Colonel Harris said these are for your eyes only," the lieutenant said, handing over the envelope. Inside, Callahan found a terse message, along with several reconnaissance photographs. The message confirmed his worst fears. The King Tigers had arrived in sector sooner than expected. Aerial reconnaissance had spotted at least 4 of the massive tanks moving toward Marigny from the east, along with numerous Panthers and infantry support. The photographs showed the King Tigers from various angles, their massive bulk dwarfing the vehicles around them. One image in particular caught Callahan's attention, showing a knocked-out Sherman next to a King Tiger. The American tank looked like a toy beside the German behemoth. Accompanying the photographs was a technical analysis prepared by intelligence officers. The King Tiger weighed almost 70 tons, nearly twice the weight of a Sherman. Its frontal armor was 150 mm thick at an optimal slope, making it virtually impenetrable to any Allied tank gun currently in the field. Its 88 mm KWK-43 main gun could penetrate 152 mm of armor at 1,000 yards, more than enough to destroy a Sherman from well beyond the effective range of the Sherman's own weapons. The only weaknesses noted were its limited mobility in rough terrain, poor reliability, high fuel consumption, and slightly thinner side and rear armor. Small consolations when facing such a monster. Callahan folded the intelligence report and tucked it into his jacket. He would have to brief his officers, but first he needed time to process what this meant for their upcoming operations. The planned advance toward Marigny would now potentially lead them directly into the path of these new German heavy tanks. He found Lieutenant Ross studying maps with the forward observer assigned to coordinate artillery support. "We need to talk," Callahan said quietly, privately. Once they had stepped away from the others, Callahan showed Ross the reconnaissance photos and intelligence report. "My God," Ross whispered, studying the images of the King Tiger. "How are we supposed to fight something like that?" "Not head-on," Callahan replied firmly. "We use terrain, we use artillery, we use air support when available, and we use our mobility, and we target their weaknesses relentlessly." "Their weaknesses being what exactly? That they might run out of gas before they kill us all?" The uncharacteristic pessimism from Ross reflected the shock of confronting such a formidable opponent. "Listen to me, John," Callahan said, his voice taking on the intensity that had carried his men through difficult situations before. "These are machines, not invincible monsters. They're crewed by men who get tired, make mistakes, and can be outthought. Their side armor is vulnerable to our 76 mm guns at close range. They're slow to traverse their turrets and have terrible visibility from inside. They can't operate effectively in close terrain. We can work with that." And Ross took a deep breath and nodded, his professional composure returning. "You're right, sir. Sorry about that. It was just the initial shock. I understand. I felt the same way when I first saw these images. But now we adapt." Callahan turned to the map. "We need to revise our approach to Marigny. Instead of the direct advance across open ground that battalion planned, we'll use this wooded stream bed to approach from the southwest. The terrain is too confined for effective deployment of their heavy tanks." "What about our scheduled rendezvous with Baker Company at this road junction?" Ross asked, pointing to the map. "We'll have to coordinate a change with battalion. I want infantry support for this operation, but we need to dictate the terms of engagement. That means choosing ground that negates the Germans' advantages and plays to ours." For the next hour, Callahan and his officers revised their tactical plan, incorporating the new intelligence about the King Tigers. The gravity of the situation was not lost on any of them, but Callahan was pleased to see his leaders respond with professional focus rather than defeatism. As dusk approached, Callahan returned to Warhound to brief his crew. They deserved to know what they might face in the coming days. "Gather round," he said, spreading the reconnaissance photos on the tank's engine deck. "This is what intelligence says we're up against." The men studied the images in silence, their expressions growing increasingly somber as they realized the implications. "That thing makes a Tiger look like a light tank," Peterson said finally. "Our rounds will bounce off it like pebbles." "Not necessarily," Callahan replied. "The frontal armor is nearly impenetrable, yes, but the sides and rear are more vulnerable, especially at close range. Our new 76mm gun with APCR ammunition can penetrate those areas if we get the right angle." "How close are we talking about, sir?" O'Malley asked, the gunner's professional interest evident. 300 yards or less for a guaranteed penetration of the side armor. Less than that for the rear. "That's practically point-blank range," Barnes observed quietly. "They'll see us coming. Not if we use the terrain properly and coordinate with the infantry and artillery." Callahan looked each man in the eye. "I won't lie to you. These will be the toughest opponents we've faced. But they're not invincible, and we're not helpless. We have speed, we have maneuverability, and most importantly, we have each other." Rodriguez, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "What about those improved tanks you mentioned, Captain? The ones that are coming?" Callahan hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "They're on their way. We should receive the first ones within 2 weeks. They have better armor protection, improved suspension for cross-country mobility, and a higher velocity 76mm gun that should be more effective against heavy armor." 2 weeks, Peterson said, shaking his head. "A lot can happen in 2 weeks. Which is why we adapt and overcome with what we have now," Callahan insisted. "We've faced tough situations before. We survived Omaha Beach, the hedgerows in St. Lo. We'll survive this too." As the men dispersed to their evening duties, Callahan felt the weight of his words. He had projected confidence because that was his responsibility as a leader. But privately he shared their concerns. The technological gap between their Shermans and the King Tigers was enormous, and no amount of tactical brilliance could fully compensate for it. Later that night, as the company settled into defensive positions along the ridge, Callahan stood watch from his commander's cupola. The rain had stopped, and stars were visible between scattered clouds. In the distance, the flash and rumble of artillery marked the ceaseless rhythm of warfare that continued even after darkness fell. A movement near the command half-track caught his attention. It was Lieutenant Colonel Abrams, who had apparently arrived while Callahan was occupied with positioning his tanks. Callahan climbed down from Warhound and approached the senior officer. "Evening, sir. I didn't expect to see you at the front." Abrams nodded in greeting. "I make it a point to stay close to the units involved in the Thunderbolt program. I received word that you've been briefed on the King Tiger presence in your sector." "Yes, sir. We're adjusting our tactics accordingly, but I won't pretend it's not a serious concern." "That's why I'm here, Captain. The timetable has changed." Abrams gestured toward the rear echelon. "Your first 2 Easy-8s are being unloaded at the maintenance assembly area right now. They'll be ready for deployment by morning." Callahan felt a surge of hope. "That's excellent news, sir." "There's more," Abrams continued. "SHAEF has authorized accelerated deployment of the entire Thunderbolt program based on the confirmed presence of King Tigers in this sector. You'll receive 4 more improved Shermans within the week, enough to re-equip your entire company eventually." The implications were significant. With a full company of improved tanks, they would stand a much better chance against the German heavy armor. "Thank you, sir. This will make a real difference." "Don't thank me yet, Captain," Abrams cautioned. "Even the Easy-8 isn't a match for a King Tiger in a frontal engagement. It gives you better odds, not guaranteed success. And for now, you'll still be operating with a mixed force of standard and improved tanks." "Understood, sir. We'll make it work." Abrams studied Callahan's face in the dim light. "I know you will. That's why you were selected for this program. Your record shows a commander who can adapt to changing circumstances and overcome technological disadvantages through superior tactics and leadership." "I appreciate the confidence, sir." "It's not just confidence, Captain. It's necessity. What happens in your sector over the next few weeks may influence the entire Allied armored doctrine for the remainder of the war. Your experiences and reports will help determine whether we rush the Pershing heavy tank into production or continue focusing on improved Shermans." Abrams gestured toward the distant sounds of combat. Out there, you and your men are writing the future of American armor. With that sobering thought, Abrams bid Callahan good night and returned to the command vehicle, leaving the tank commander to contemplate the broader implications of the challenges ahead. As Callahan returned to Warhound, he found himself in the uniquely difficult position of a combat commander who understood too well the strategic context of his tactical decisions. Most officers in his position fought their battles with limited knowledge of the bigger picture, focusing simply on their immediate objectives. But now he knew that the performance of his company against the King Tigers would have ripple effects far beyond their small corner of Normandy. The weight of that responsibility settled onto his shoulders as he climbed back into the commander's cupola for his watch. In the distance, the horizon occasionally lit up with artillery flashes, illuminating the clouds from below like heat lightning. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the massive King Tigers waited, their 88 guns ready to reach out and destroy Sherman tanks with mechanical efficiency. Tomorrow, Callahan would see the first of the Easy Eights, the tanks that might give his men a fighting chance against the steel monsters they faced. But tonight he kept his vigilant watch, listening to the sounds of his sleeping crew below, men who trusted him with their lives and who would follow him into the valley of steel that awaited them. The first light of dawn revealed a landscape transformed by war. The gentle Norman hills that had once nurtured apple orchards and grazing cattle now bore the scars of artillery craters, tank tracks, and hastily dug fighting positions. Morning mist clung to the low ground, creating an otherworldly atmosphere as Captain Robert Callahan made his way to the maintenance assembly area where the promised Easy 8 Shermans awaited. Callahan had slept little during the night, his mind occupied with the tactical implications of integrating the new tanks into his depleted company. The decisions he would make today about which crews received the improved Shermans would quite literally determine who among his men had the best chance of survival in the coming engagements with the German King Tigers. The maintenance area bustled with activity despite the early hour. Technicians and mechanics swarmed over two olive-drab Sherman tanks that, at first glance, looked little different from the rest of the company's vehicles. But as Callahan drew closer, the differences became apparent. Master Sergeant Wilson, the battalion maintenance chief, spotted Callahan approaching and hurried over, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had long since lost any cleaning effectiveness. "Morning, Captain. Come to see your new toys." "They're not toys, Sergeant," Callahan replied without heat. "They're the difference between life and death for my men." Wilson's expression sobered. "Yes, sir, of course. Sorry about that." He gestured toward the tanks. "These are the first M4A3E8s we've received in the ETO. Horizontal volute spring suspension, hence the Easy 8 nickname. Smoother ride, better cross-country performance, and improved stability when firing on the move." Callahan walked a slow circle around the nearest tank. The profile was similar to the standard Sherman, but the suspension system was visibly different, with wider tracks that would provide better flotation in soft ground. The 76mm gun looked identical to the ones on their newer replacement tanks, but Wilson assured him it had an improved high-velocity mount that increased penetrating power. "What about ammunition storage?" Callahan asked, recalling the deadly tendency of standard Shermans to catch fire when hit, a vulnerability that had earned them the grim nickname Ronson lighters after the popular cigarette lighter slogan, "Lights first time, every time." "That's the best part," Wilson said, his enthusiasm returning. "They've added wet storage for the main gun ammunition. The rounds are stored in water jacket containers below the turret ring. Even if they're hit, the chance of catastrophic fire is significantly reduced." Callahan felt a surge of hope. That improvement alone could save countless lives. Too many of his men had died not from the initial impact of enemy rounds, but from the resulting ammunition fires that turned their tanks into funeral pyres. "When will they be ready?" "They're ready now, sir. Fully fueled, ammo loaded, and test fired yesterday evening after arrival. Just need your crews." "Thank you, Sergeant. I'll send them over within the hour." As Callahan turned to leave, Wilson called after him. "Captain, the boys up at Schaeff must think highly of your outfit, giving you first crack at these. Make 'em count." "We will," Callahan promised, feeling the weight of that responsibility as he headed back to the company position. The question that had kept him awake most of the night still loomed large. Which of his 9 remaining tank crews would receive these potential lifesavers? The fair approach would be to assign them based on position in the company structure, with himself as company commander, taking 1, and his executive officer, Lieutenant Ross, taking the other. But was that the most effective tactical deployment? When he reached the company area, he found his officers already gathered around the command half-track, waiting for the morning briefing. The men looked tired but alert, their faces showing the strain of continuous combat operations, but also the professional focus that had carried them through the brutal hedgerow fighting. "Gentlemen," Callahan began without preamble, "our first two Easy Eights have arrived. They'll be assigned to 1st Platoon, specifically to my tank and Sergeant Wallace's. I want crews ready to transfer equipment within 30 minutes." Lieutenant Parker, the 2nd platoon leader, couldn't hide his disappointment. "Sir, with respect, my platoon is taking point on today's advance. Wouldn't it make more sense for us to have the improved tanks?" It was a reasonable question, one that Callahan had wrestled with through the pre-dawn hours. "Under normal circumstances, yes, but I'm modifying our tactical approach based on the presence of the King Tigers. 1st Platoon will now take point, with my tank and Wallace's serving as a heavy reconnaissance element. The rest of the company will follow in standard formation, prepared to execute the Wolfpack tactics we discussed if we encounter enemy armor." He could see the calculations running behind Parker's eyes, the mental adjustments being made to the expected order of battle. The young lieutenant was a good officer, flexible and quick to adapt. "Understood, sir. We'll adjust our approach accordingly." Callahan detailed the rest of the day's operations plan, incorporating the changes necessitated by the arrival of the Easy Eights. When the briefing concluded, he pulled Lieutenant Ross aside. "John, I know it's unorthodox not assigning you one of the new tanks, but I need someone I trust absolutely in command of the main body while I'm forward with the reconnaissance element." Ross nodded. "I understand, sir. No offense taken. The tactical logic is sound." He hesitated before adding, "Just make sure you don't get yourself knocked out playing point man. The company needs you more than it needs an Easy Eight." Callahan clasped his XO's shoulder briefly, acknowledging the concern without directly addressing it. They both knew that commanding from the front carried additional risks, but it was the only leadership style Callahan knew, the only one his men would respect. Word of the new tanks spread quickly through the company. By the time Callahan returned to Warhound, his crew was already preparing for the transfer, gathering personal equipment in the various unofficial modifications and comforts they had accumulated during months of combat. "So we're getting one of the new ones, Cap?" Peterson asked, his hands never stopping their methodical work of collecting tools and spare parts. "That's right. You and the rest of the crew head over to the maintenance area and familiarize yourselves with the differences. I'll join you after I finish the coordination with Battalion." As the men headed off, excitement evident in their quickened pace, Callahan felt a momentary pang of guilt about the crews not receiving upgraded tanks. Every man in the company deserved the best possible chance of survival. But war rarely afforded the luxury of perfect fairness, and leadership meant making the hard choices that served the greater mission. An hour later, Callahan stood before their new tank, now bearing the transferred name Warhound 2, hastily painted on its hull by Rodriguez. The crew had already completed their familiarization, each man reporting on the differences relevant to his position. "Suspension's a dream," Peterson enthused. "Rode it around the maintenance yard, feels half the vibration of our old girl, and the steering responds like a sports car compared to the original." O'Malley was more measured but no less positive. "Turret traverse is smoother, gun stabilization is improved. I'll need some time to adjust to the new sight, but the improved optics should give us better target acquisition, especially at long range." Barnes, the radio operator, reported that the electrical systems were more reliable, with better shielding against interference. Rodriguez, the loader, appreciated the more logical ammunition storage arrangement, though he noted that the shells for the high-velocity gun were slightly heavier and would take some adjustment. As Callahan listened to his men's assessments, he found himself wondering if these incremental improvements would be enough against the monstrous King Tiger. Better suspension, improved optics, and more reliable ammunition storage were all valuable advances, but they didn't change the fundamental equation of armor thickness and gun penetration that so heavily favored the German heavy tanks. Still, armies fought with the equipment they had, not what they wished for, and sometimes, as military history had repeatedly shown, superior tactics and training could overcome technological disadvantages. "Mount up," Callahan ordered, checking his watch. "We move out in 20 minutes. Wallace's tank will join us at the line of departure." The interior of the Easy Eight felt both familiar and subtly different, like returning to one's childhood home after years away. The basic layout remained the same, but numerous small improvements were evident. Better padding on the seats, more logical control placement, improved ventilation. It was still cramped by any civilian standard, but to men who had lived in the confining spaces of a standard Sherman for months, it felt almost luxurious. Callahan settled into the commander's position, feeling the different balance of the turret as it traversed. The new tank smell of paint, oil, and fresh steel mingled with the transferred personal equipment of the crew, creating an odd blend of the novel and the familiar. At precisely 0800 hours, Charlie Company moved out. Callahan's and Wallace's Easy Eights took the lead, advancing cautiously toward the small stream that marked the boundary of their current position. Behind them, the remaining 7 Shermans of the company followed in a staggered formation designed to provide overlapping fields of fire while minimizing their vulnerability to artillery. The morning mist had mostly burned away, providing good visibility across the rolling farmland that lay before them. Callahan stood in his commander's hatch, binoculars scanning the terrain ahead with practiced efficiency. Beside him, Wallace's tank kept perfect station, the veteran sergeant having adjusted immediately to the improved handling characteristics of the Easy 8. They reached the stream without incident and began to follow its course southwestward, using the tree line along its banks for concealment. According to the revised plan, they would approach the village of St. Martin from the southwest, rather than the direct easterly approach originally ordered by battalion. This indirect route would take them through terrain less suitable for heavy tank operations, hopefully negating some of the King Tiger's advantages. Movement. 10 o'clock. Near that stone farmhouse, O'Malley reported from his gunner's position. Infantry, I think. Callahan swung his binoculars to the indicated position. German patrol, about a squad strength. Range 900 yards. Looks like they haven't spotted us yet. He considered his options. Engaging the patrol would reveal their position and alert the Germans to their approach from this unexpected direction. But allowing the patrol to continue might mean they would be spotted anyway, losing the element of surprise without gaining any advantage. O'Malley, target the patrol with the coaxial machine gun. On my command. The gunner acknowledged, traversing the turret slightly and adjusting his sight picture. Wallace, continue advance. We'll suppress the patrol and follow. Driver, prepare to advance at maximum speed after we engage. A chorus of acknowledgments came through the headphones as the crew prepared for action. Callahan waited until Wallace's tank had progressed another 50 yards along their planned route before giving the command. Fire! The coaxial machine gun chattered, sending a stream of tracer rounds toward the German patrol. At this range, the accuracy would be limited, but the suppressive effect was immediate. The German soldiers dove for cover, some returning fire ineffectively at the distant tanks. Driver, advance, Callahan ordered, and Peterson sent the Shermans surging forward, the improved suspension smoothing out the rough ground as they raced to catch up with Wallace. The brief engagement was their first test of the Easy 8 in combat conditions, and the results were promising. The tank handled the rapid acceleration and rough terrain with noticeably better stability than their previous Sherman, allowing O'Malley to maintain fire on the patrol with greater accuracy despite the movement. As they rejoined Wallace's tank and continued their advance, Callahan felt a cautious optimism. The Easy 8 represented a genuine improvement over the standard Sherman. The question remained whether these improvements would be enough against the steel monsters they might soon face. They continued their approach to St. Martin through the morning hours, encountering only scattered resistance from German reconnaissance elements. By noon, they had reached the wooded high ground overlooking the village from the southwest, exactly as planned. From this vantage point, Callahan could see the village and the surrounding terrain clearly, including the more open ground to the east where the direct approach would have left them vulnerable. Wallace, hold position here and maintain observation. I'm going to bring the main body up to this position. Keep your radio on company frequency. Roger that, Captain. We'll keep our eyes peeled. Callahan directed Peterson to turn the tank around and head back along their route to guide the rest of the company forward. The Easy 8 handled the maneuver smoothly, the wider tracks maintaining excellent traction even on the rain-softened ground. They had traveled perhaps half a mile back toward the main body when Barnes called out from his radio position. Captain, priority message from Wallace. Put it through, Callahan ordered, his body tensing at the urgency in Barnes's voice. Wallace's transmission was broken by static but clear enough in its essential details. Charlie 1, this is Charlie 2-5. Enemy armor observed entering St. Martin from the east. Count 4 tanks, at least one confirmed King Tiger. Others appear to be Panthers. Over. Callahan felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. The moment they had been preparing for had arrived. Charlie 2-5, maintain position but do not engage. Observe and report. I'm bringing up the company, out. He switched to the company frequency. All Charlie elements. This is Charlie 1. Enemy armor confirmed at objective. Accelerate to my position. Prepare to execute Plan Bravo. Acknowledge. A series of terse acknowledgments followed as the remainder of the company responded. Plan Bravo was the Wolfpack approach they had discussed, designed specifically to deal with superior enemy armor through coordinated attacks from multiple angles. Peterson, get us back to Wallace double time. The driver responded immediately, pushing the Easy 8 to its maximum cross-country speed. The improved suspension proved its worth again as they raced over uneven ground that would have shaken the teeth loose in a standard Sherman. When they rejoined Wallace at the observation position, the situation had developed further. The German tanks had deployed around St. Martin in what appeared to be a defensive position, with the massive King Tiger occupying a central location that gave it clear fields of fire across the likely approach routes from the east. The Germans were clearly expecting an attack from that direction, unaware that Charlie Company was already in position to the southwest. Callahan studied the deployment through his binoculars. The King Tiger was a truly imposing presence, its massive bulk dwarfing even the Panthers that accompanied it. The heavy tank's 88mm gun could reach out to ranges far beyond the effective range of even the improved 76mm on the Easy 8s, and its frontal armor was all but impervious to their weapons. But Callahan also noted vulnerabilities in the German position. The King Tiger was oriented toward the east, its thick frontal armor facing the expected direction of attack. From their current position, they could potentially approach from the flank or rear, where the armor was thinner and more vulnerable to their guns. The rest of Charlie Company arrived at the observation position in good order, the tank commanders gathering around Callahan for a final briefing before the attack. The situation is as follows. Callahan began, sketching a quick diagram of the village and the German positions in the dirt. 1 King Tiger and 3 Panthers deployed around St. Martin. They're oriented east, expecting an attack from that direction. We have an opportunity to hit them from an unexpected angle and potentially neutralize the King Tiger before it can bring its main gun to bear effectively. He outlined the modified attack plan, assigning specific roles to each tank. The 2 Easy 8s would lead the initial assault, approaching from the southwest, using the terrain for cover until the last possible moment. The remaining Shermans would split into 3 groups, approaching from different angles to divide the Germans' attention and create multiple threats they would have to address simultaneously. The key to success is coordination and timing, Callahan emphasized. We strike together from multiple directions, focusing our fire on individual targets until they are neutralized. The King Tiger is primary target, but don't fixate on it at the expense of situational awareness. The Panthers are deadly in their own right. He checked his watch. We attack in 20 minutes. That gives the artillery time to register their targets and the infantry to move into support positions. Questions? There were none. The plan was clear, the objectives understood. Each man knew his role and the stakes involved. The success or failure of their attack would not only determine their own fates, but potentially influence the wider development of American armored doctrine. Very well, mount up and move to your start positions. Communications check at H-5 minutes. As the commanders dispersed to their tanks, Lieutenant Ross lingered for a moment. Good luck, sir. Callahan nodded. You too, John. Remember, if anything happens to me, you take command of the company. Nothing's going to happen to you, sir, not with that new tank of yours. Callahan managed a tight smile but made no reply. They both knew that in combat, no amount of technological advantage could guarantee survival. All it took was one well-placed enemy shell, one moment of bad luck or inattention. Back in Warhound 2, the crew was preparing for battle with the focused efficiency that came from months of shared combat experience. Each man checked and rechecked his equipment and position, running through mental checklists developed through hard-won experience. All right, listen up, Callahan said, gathering their attention. This will be our first engagement with the King Tiger. Everything we've heard about it is probably true. It's bigger, more heavily armored, and has a more powerful gun than anything we've faced before. But it's also slower, less maneuverable, and crewed by men just as fallible as we are. He met each man's eyes in turn. We have advantages they don't. We have surprise, we have maneuverability, and we have each other. We strike together, we support each other, and we exploit every weakness we can find. Clear? Clear, sir, they responded in near unison. Peterson, move us to the start position. As the Easy 8 rolled forward to the shallow depression that would serve as their jumping-off point for the attack, Callahan performed his own pre-combat ritual, checking his personal weapons and equipment. The company commander's .45 caliber pistol, more a symbol of authority than a practical weapon in tank warfare. The map case with the latest tactical overlays. The gold wedding band on his left hand, a tangible reminder of what waited for him if he survived this war. The minutes ticked down inexorably toward the attack time. At H-5 minutes, Callahan initiated the communications check, each tank in the company reporting readiness in sequence. The artillery forward observer confirmed that the fire support was registered and ready. At H-1 minute, a tense silence fell over the company net. Each man was alone with his thoughts now, performing whatever personal ritual or prayer served to prepare him for the chaos of combat. "Driver, advance," Callahan ordered as his watch indicated the attack time had arrived. Around him, he knew the other tanks of the company were also moving forward, each element following its assigned approach to create the coordinated attack they had planned. Warhound 2 moved smoothly up and out of the depression, picking up speed as it crested the rise. The village of St. Martin lay before them, the German tanks visible now in the clear afternoon light. For a critical few seconds, they advanced undetected, closing the distance before the Germans realized they were under attack from an unexpected direction. The spell was broken by the thunder of artillery landing on the eastern edge of the village. The pre-planned barrage designed to reinforce the Germans' expectation of attack from that direction. As the explosions blossomed across the landscape, Callahan saw the German tanks begin to react, turrets traversing as their commanders recognized the true threat. "Target Panther, right side of the church, range 800 yards, Callahan ordered. "Identified," O'Malley confirmed from the gunner's position. "APCR loaded. Fire when ready." The 76mm gun roared, the improved stabilization of the Easy 8 allowing for a remarkably steady firing platform, despite their movement. Through his binoculars, Callahan saw the round strike the Panther's turret, deflecting upward without penetrating. "Shot deflected, adjusting," O'Malley reported calmly, already making corrections. "Gunner, target the track," Callahan ordered. "Let's immobilize it first." The second shot rang out, finding its mark. The Panther's left track shattered, throwing metal fragments in a deadly spray. The German tank slewed to a halt, now unable to maneuver but still very much in the fight, its turret continuing to traverse toward them. To their left, Wallace's Easy 8 was engaging another Panther, the two American tanks having divided their targets according to plan. In the distance, Callahan could see the other elements of Charlie Company emerging from their approach roads, creating the multiple threat axes that were central to their attack plan. The King Tiger had finally recognized the threat from the southwest and was laboriously turning its massive bulk to bring its fearsome 88mm gun to bear. The process was slow, hampered by the narrow village streets and the tank's inherent lack of maneuverability. "Shift target to the King Tiger," Callahan ordered. "Aim for the rear drive wheels." "Sir, range 600 and closing," O'Malley acknowledged, adjusting his sight picture. "All Charlie elements. This is Charlie 1. King Tiger is turning to face southwest. Elements approaching from southeast and northeast continue advance. Target Panthers first. Over." The battle was unfolding according to plan, with the German tanks forced to divide their attention among threats from multiple directions. The King Tiger, designed to dominate a battlefield through frontal engagement with its nearly impenetrable armor and powerful gun, was now struggling to respond to attacks from unexpected angles. O'Malley fired again, the shell streaking toward the King Tiger's vulnerable rear section. Callahan watched intently through his binoculars, hoping to see the impact disable the massive tank. Instead, he witnessed a scene straight from his worst tactical nightmares. The round struck the King Tiger but deflected off the angled rear armor without penetrating. Simultaneously, the German monster completed its turn, bringing its 88mm gun to bear directly on Warhound 2. "Evasive action!" Callahan shouted. "Hard left, maximum speed." Peterson reacted instantly, throwing the Easy 8 into a sharp turn that sent it lurching behind a stone farmhouse just as the King Tiger fired. The 88mm shell passed through the space they had occupied a second earlier, continuing on to explode in a field beyond with a thunderous detonation that emphasized the power of the German weapon. "That was too close," Barnes muttered from his radio position. "Stay focused," Callahan admonished, though he silently agreed with the assessment. "O'Malley, prepare to engage again when we clear the farmhouse. Rodriguez, make sure we have APCR loaded." "APCR ready?" the loader confirmed, the strain of the moment evident in his voice despite his professional demeanor. "All elements, continue the attack," Callahan ordered over the company frequency. "Maintain pressure from multiple directions. The King Tiger can't target all of us at once." The battle had now devolved into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the Sherman tanks using their superior mobility to strike from different angles while the German tanks attempted to bring their more powerful guns to bear. It was precisely the scenario Callahan had envisioned when developing their Wolfpack tactics, but experiencing it firsthand was infinitely more harrowing than any planning session could convey. "Ready to emerge on the north side of the farmhouse," Peterson reported. "On your command, Cap." "Execute," Callahan ordered, bracing himself for their next engagement with the King Tiger. The EZ-8 accelerated smoothly from behind the stone structure, its improved suspension allowing Peterson to maintain better control than would have been possible in a standard Sherman. As they cleared the building, Callahan immediately assessed the tactical situation. The King Tiger had shifted position, anticipating their emergence. Its massive turret was already traversing toward them, the 88mm gun seeking to draw a bead on the American tank. But the German commander had made a critical error, exposing the tank's side armor to the southeastern approach route where Lieutenant Ross was leading 3 Shermans in a coordinated attack. "Target the King Tiger's turret ring," Callahan ordered. "Fire as soon as you have the shot." By targeting the junction between the turret and hull, they might disable the traverse mechanism, preventing the 88mm gun from tracking targets effectively. Even as O'Malley lined up his shot, Callahan saw Ross's group of Shermans open fire on the King Tiger's exposed flank. Multiple 75mm shells struck the German tank in rapid succession, most deflecting but one penetrating at a vulnerable joint in the armor plates. Black smoke began to pour from the King Tiger's engine compartment, indicating significant internal damage. Its turret continued to rotate, however, the 88mm gun still very much a threat. "On the way," O'Malley called as he fired. The 76mm shell from the EZ-8 struck precisely where Callahan had directed, at the base of the turret ring. There was no dramatic explosion, no catastrophic destruction of the German tank. Instead, the turret simply stopped moving, frozen in place with the gun pointed away from Warhound 2. "Direct hit on turret mechanism," Callahan reported. "King Tiger immobilized and turret disabled. Maintain fire on engine compartment." The coordinated attack continued, with Sherman tanks engaging the King Tiger from multiple angles. Without the ability to maneuver or bring its main gun to bear effectively, the German heavy tank was neutralized as a threat despite its superior armor and weaponry. Eventually, white smoke began to pour from the King Tiger's hatches, the international signal of a tank crew surrendering. The German tankers began to emerge, hands raised. "Cease fire on the King Tiger," Callahan ordered. "Infantry will secure the prisoners. Shift targets to remaining Panthers." The battle for St. Martin continued for another 30 minutes, but with the King Tiger neutralized, the outcome was never in doubt. The German Panthers, though formidable tanks in their own right, were overwhelmed by the coordinated attacks of Charlie Company's Shermans. By late afternoon, the village was secured, with 2 Panthers destroyed and 1 captured relatively intact. As the company regrouped at the village center, Callahan conducted a damage assessment. Remarkably, they had accomplished their mission without losing a single tank, though 3 Shermans had sustained damage requiring maintenance. The combination of surprise, coordinated tactics, and the improved capabilities of the EZ-8s had allowed them to overcome the technological advantages of the German tanks. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams arrived at the scene shortly after the fighting concluded, having monitored the battle through reports to battalion headquarters. "Impressive work, Watson," he said as he surveyed the disabled King Tiger, now under guard by American infantry. "Your tactical approach proved more effective than I anticipated." "Thank you, sir." The EZ-8s made a significant difference, especially in terms of maneuverability and gun stabilization. But it was the coordinated attack from multiple angles that really neutralized the King Tiger's advantages. Abrams nodded thoughtfully. "The preliminary report indicates that your 76mm guns didn't actually penetrate the King Tiger's main armor, even from the sides. It was the concentrated fire at weak points that disabled it. That's correct, sir. We targeted the tracks, drive wheels, and turret ring rather than trying to penetrate the main armor plates. Immobilize first, then neutralize. A lesson for our tank destroyer doctrine, perhaps, Abrams mused. Speed, maneuverability, and coordinated tactics over raw firepower and armor thickness. As they walked around the massive German tank, Callahan could see that Abrams was making mental notes, assessing the implications of this engagement for future tank development and tactical doctrine. I'd like a full after-action report as soon as possible, Abrams said. Every detail of how your company engaged and neutralized this vehicle will be valuable to our development program. Of course, sir. I'll have it ready by tomorrow morning. Excellent. Abrams paused, studying Callahan's face. How would you assess the EZ-8's performance in this engagement? It was the question Callahan had been asking himself since the battle ended. The improved Sherman had certainly performed well, offering tangible advantages over the standard model. But had those improvements been decisive? The EZ-8 is a significant improvement over the standard Sherman, he began carefully. The enhanced suspension provided better stability when firing on the move, which improved our accuracy. The wider tracks gave us better mobility in soft ground. And while we haven't had an opportunity to test it yet, the wet ammunition storage should reduce catastrophic fires when hit. But, Abrams prompted, sensing the reservation in Callahan's assessment, but it's still not a match for the German heavy tanks in terms of armor or firepower. We won today through superior tactics, coordination, and frankly, a bit of luck in catching them oriented in the wrong direction. In a head-to-head engagement, the King Tiger would still overmatch the EZ-8 in nearly every category that matters. Abrams nodded slowly. That's a fair assessment, and it's consistent with what our technical analysis suggested. He looked thoughtfully at the disemboweled King Tiger. The question facing the Ordnance Department now is whether to focus on further incremental improvements to the Sherman platform or to accelerate development of a heavier tank like the Pershing. If I may offer an opinion, sir, that's why you're part of the Thunderbolt program, Captain. Your combat experience makes your opinion valuable. Callahan chose his words carefully, aware of the potential impact his assessment might have on future tank development. Based on today's engagement, I believe we need both approaches. The EZ-8 represents an excellent evolution of the Sherman, maximizing its strengths while addressing some of its critical weaknesses. It's a tank we can produce in numbers now, and with proper tactics, it can be effective even against superior German armor. But longer term, he continued, we need a tank that can meet the Germans on more equal terms. Something with the armor protection and firepower to stand toe-to-toe with a Panther or Tiger if necessary. The tactical flexibility to choose between maneuver warfare and direct engagement would be invaluable. Abrams nodded, seemingly satisfied with the assessment. That perspective will be helpful to the decision makers. In the meantime, you and your company have provided an excellent demonstration of how to effectively employ the tanks we have against the threats we face. As Abrams had departed to inspect the captured Panther, Callahan rejoined his company, making the rounds to check on his men and their vehicles. Despite the success of the engagement, he knew they couldn't count on similar favorable circumstances in future battles. The Germans would adapt, developing countermeasures to the Wolfpack tactics that had proven so effective today. The war of tank against tank would continue to evolve, a deadly contest of technological advancement and tactical innovation. For now, Charlie Company had won an important victory, neutralizing one of the most fearsome weapons in the German arsenal. But tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to overcome. As the sun began to set over the Norman countryside, casting long shadows across the battle-scarred village of St. Martin, Callahan gathered his officers for a debriefing. There would be little rest tonight, with defensive positions to establish, damage to repair, and plans to make for the next day's operations. But they would face those tasks with the confidence that came from success, from the knowledge that even the mighty King Tiger could be defeated through skill, coordination, and the will to fight. Chapter 6. Technical Challenges and Human Solutions. The following days saw Charlie Company advancing steadily eastward, pressing the advantage created by their victory at St. Martin. The Germans were withdrawing toward more defensible positions around Marigny, conducting a fighting retreat that tested the Americans' endurance and resolve. For Callahan and his men, it was a time of continuous adaptation and learning. The two EZ-8s had proven their worth in several engagements. demonstrating tangible advantages over the standard Shermans. But they had also revealed limitations that tempered Callahan's initial optimism about the improved tanks. On the third day after St. Martin, the company had established a temporary headquarters in an abandoned farm complex near the hamlet of Beaucoudray. The building showed the scars of recent fighting, with bullet holes peppering the walls, and one corner of the main house collapsed from an artillery hit. But the structures offered better protection than the open fields, and the elevated position provided good observation of the surrounding countryside. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams had rejoined the company that morning, bringing with him technical specialists from Ordnance Branch to examine the captured Panther. The German tank had been transported to the farm complex under cover of darkness, where it could be studied away from enemy observation. Callahan found Abrams and the technicians surrounding the Panther in the farm's main courtyard. Various components laid out on tarps as they methodically disassembled critical systems for analysis. "Ah, Captain Callahan," Abrams greeted him. "Come see what our German friends have been up to." Callahan approached the disassembled tank with professional interest. Despite being the enemy's weapon, he couldn't help but admire the engineering that had gone into the Panther's design. "They've made some interesting choices," observed Major Hastings, the lead technical specialist. "The interleaved road wheel design provides excellent weight distribution but makes maintenance a nightmare. Remove one damaged wheel, and you have to take off half the suspension assembly." "Trade-offs," Abrams commented. "Every tank design involves compromises between firepower, protection, mobility, and sustainability." Hastings nodded, pointing to various components. "The Germans have clearly prioritized firepower and frontal protection over mobility and ease of maintenance. The transmission is particularly troublesome. Drivers need to be exceptionally skilled to handle these machines effectively." Callahan examined this Panther's main gun, a 75mm KWK-42, with a much longer barrel than the American 76mm. "Their gun design emphasizes velocity over shell weight," he observed, "higher penetration at the cost of explosive filler." "Precisely," Hastings confirmed. "The German philosophy focuses on killing tanks rather than supporting infantry. It's a fundamentally different approach to armored warfare than our doctrine emphasizes." The conversation continued in this technical vein for some time, with the specialist pointing out various features of the Panther's design and comparing them to American tank development. Callahan absorbed the information with keen interest, recognizing that understanding the enemy's equipment was crucial to developing effective countermeasures. "Captain," Abrams said, finally drawing Callahan aside from the group, "I'd like your assessment of the EZ-8s after these past few days of operations. The formal reports are valuable, but I want your unvarnished personal opinion." Callahan considered the question carefully. The EZ-8s had performed well overall, but certain issues had become apparent with extended use. "The improved suspension is a game changer," he began. "The ride quality makes a significant difference in crew endurance, and the stability when firing on the move has improved our first-round hit probability substantially. The wider tracks perform better in soft ground, though we haven't had to cross truly difficult terrain yet." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "The wet ammunition storage is perhaps the most important improvement from a crew survival standpoint, though thankfully we haven't had to test it under fire. One of 2nd Platoon's standard Shermans was penetrated yesterday, and the resulting ammunition fire destroyed the tank completely. The crew barely escaped." Abrams nodded grimly. "I saw the report. Continue." "On the negative side, the 76mm gun, even with the higher velocity mount, is still inadequate against the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers. We've confirmed penetrations against the side armor at ranges under 500 yards, but that requires us to maneuver into positions that expose our own vulnerabilities." "What about maintenance and reliability?" "Generally good, though the more complex suspension requires additional attention. Peterson, my driver, has noted that the transmission runs hotter than in the standard Sherman, which could become an issue in extended operations." Abrams made notes as Callahan spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When the captain had finished his assessment, the colonel tucked away his notebook and gazed thoughtfully at the distant tree line, where occasional artillery flashes marked the continuing combat. "Your observations align with what we're hearing from other units testing the EZ-8, he said. "The improvements are meaningful, but they don't fundamentally change the equation when facing German heavy tanks." He turned back to Callahan. "We're accelerating production of the T-26 Pershing, but the first units won't reach the European theater until early next year. In the meantime, we're shipping every available EZ-8 to frontline units, prioritizing those most likely to encounter enemy armor. That's welcome news, sir. When can we expect the additional tanks you mentioned? The first two are en route now, scheduled to arrive tomorrow. The remaining units should follow within the week. Abrams hesitated, then added, "There's also a special modification I'd like to discuss with you, something we're calling the Rhino device." He led Callahan to a covered truck parked nearby, where a tarpaulin concealed something mounted on the vehicle's front. Pulling back the cover, Abrams revealed a strange contraption that resembled a large steel prong attached to the truck's bumper. "This is a prototype," Abrams explained, "designed to be mounted on the front of a Sherman. It's essentially a specialized plow that cuts through the hedgerows, allowing the tank to push through rather than climbing over." Callahan examined the device with interest. The hedgerows of Normandy had been a significant obstacle to tank operations, with their earthen embankments often forcing tanks to expose their vulnerable underbellies when attempting to cross. "We've been using explosive charges and bulldozer Shermans," Callahan noted, "but both methods have drawbacks." "Exactly. The Rhino device allows any Sherman to create its own path through a hedgerow without specialized equipment or explosives. We're considering equipping every tank in certain units with this modification." As they discussed the technical details of the Rhino device and its potential tactical applications, Callahan was struck by the contrast between the American and German approaches to problem solving. While the Germans built increasingly massive and complex tanks that pushed the limits of engineering, the Americans focused on practical adaptations and incremental improvements to existing platforms. Each philosophy had its strengths and weaknesses, reflecting the different industrial and military cultures of the opposing forces. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Ross, who approached with a grim expression that immediately put Callahan on alert. "Sir, we've just received intelligence from Division. The Germans are moving in reinforcements from the 2nd SS Panzer Division. Aerial reconnaissance reports at least a dozen tanks, including more King Tigers, advancing toward Marigny." Callahan exchanged a glance with Abrams. The victory at St. Martin had been significant but limited in scope. A full company of German heavy tanks, supported by infantry and artillery, would present a far more formidable challenge. "When are they expected to reach Marigny?" Callahan asked. "Within 48 hours, according to S2. They're moving mostly at night to avoid air attack." "Thank you, Lieutenant. Have the platoon leaders meet me at the CP in 15 minutes for a briefing." As Ross departed, Callahan turned back to Abrams. "It seems our tactical innovations are about to face a more thorough test, sir." "So it would appear," Abrams agreed. "I'll contact Division about accelerating the delivery of your remaining Easy-8s. You may need them sooner than anticipated." The tactical situation was evolving rapidly, forcing Callahan and his officers to adapt their plans accordingly. The German reinforcements represented a serious threat, potentially reversing the gains they had made since St. Martin. But it also provided an opportunity to further test their Wolfpack tactics against German heavy tanks, this time with the benefit of experience from their previous encounter. The officers' briefing that followed was characterized by the focused professionalism that Callahan had worked to instill in his command. Each man understood the gravity of the situation but approached the challenge with clear-headed determination rather than defeatism. "The key is to maintain our tactical flexibility," Callahan emphasized as they studied the maps spread across the farmhouse table. "We know the Wolfpack approach works against individual King Tigers, but facing multiple heavy tanks simultaneously will require even more coordination and mutual support." Lieutenant Parker pointed to a section of the map showing a wooded area west of Marigny. "If we establish positions here, we can create interlocking fields of fire while maintaining concealment, force them to advance into our prepared positions rather than meeting them in open ground." "Good thinking," Callahan agreed, "and we'll need to coordinate closely with artillery and air support. The P-47s have proven effective against German armor when available." The planning session continued late into the evening, with each officer contributing insights based on their combat experience. The result was a comprehensive defense plan that leveraged their understanding of both the terrain and the German tactics they were likely to encounter. As the officers dispersed to brief their platoons, Callahan stepped outside for a moment of solitude before returning to Warhound 2. The night air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of artillery and the closer noises of a military unit at rest, the low murmur of conversations, the occasional laugh, the metallic sounds of weapons being cleaned. Sergeant O'Malley approached, cigarette glowing in the darkness. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Always, Mike. What's on your mind?" The gunner took a deep drag on his cigarette before responding. The men are talking about the German reinforcements. There's some concern about facing multiple King Tigers, especially among the crew still in standard Shermans. Callahan had anticipated this. The stark reality of the technological disparity between their tanks and the German heavies was impossible to ignore, particularly for crews who had seen the devastating effects of the 88mm gun. What's your assessment of morale? O'Malley considered the question carefully. Not bad, all things considered. The victory at St. Martin boosted confidence, but they're not fools. They know the odds we're up against. And your personal opinion? About our chances? O'Malley shrugged. The Easy Eight's help. The tactics you've developed make sense. But at the end of the day, we're still driving 30-ton tanks against 70-ton monsters with bigger guns and thicker armor. He flicked his cigarette away, the ember arcing through the darkness. It comes down to whether our advantages in mobility and tactics can overcome their advantages in raw firepower and protection, and a healthy dose of luck. Callahan nodded, appreciating the gunner's honest assessment. Tell the men I'm meeting with each crew tomorrow morning. I want to address their concerns directly and make sure everyone understands our approach. Will do, sir, and for what it's worth, they trust you. That counts for a lot when the shells start flying. After O'Malley departed, Callahan remained outside for a few more minutes, contemplating the challenges ahead. The technological gap between American and German tanks was a stark reality that no amount of tactical brilliance could fully overcome. Yet they had no choice but to fight with the equipment available to them, finding ways to maximize their advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. As he finally turned toward Warhound 2 and the few hours of rest he might manage before the next day's operations, Callahan reflected on the nature of warfare as a contest not just of weapons, but of wills. The superior tank didn't always win. Victory often went to the side that could adapt more quickly, that could overcome material disadvantages through innovation, coordination, and sheer determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they prepared to face the German reinforcements. But tonight, his men would rest, gathering strength for the battles to come. And Callahan would do the same, carrying the weight of command, but also the quiet confidence that came from knowing his crew and his company would give everything they had to accomplish their mission, regardless of the odds they faced. Dawn broke over the Norman countryside with a crimson sky that seemed to presage the bloodshed to come. Captain Robert Callahan stood on a small rise west of Marini, surveying the terrain through his binoculars as first light revealed the landscape that would soon become a battlefield. Behind him, Charlie Company's tanks were positioned in the tree line, their olive-drab hulls concealed among the foliage, their guns pointed toward the small town that was their objective. The promised reinforcements had arrived overnight, 4 more Easy 8 Shermans to complement the 2 already in service with the company. Callahan had spent the pre-dawn hours reorganizing his command, ensuring that each platoon now had at least 2 of the improved tanks. The remaining 3 standard Shermans were positioned in supporting roles, where their vulnerabilities would be less exposed. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams approached, his face grave in the early morning light. Intelligence update, Captain. Aerial reconnaissance confirms at least 3 King Tigers among the German armor moving toward Marini. The remainder appear to be Panthers, with supporting infantry and half-tracks. Callahan nodded, absorbing this information with the practiced calm that his men had come to rely upon. Estimated time of arrival? They were observed crossing the Lozon River at 300 hours. Given their typical rate of advance when trying to avoid air detection, they should reach Marini by mid-morning. That gives us time to complete our preparations. Callahan lowered his binoculars, turning to face Abrams directly. The plan remains as discussed. We'll establish defensive positions on this ridgeline with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery is pre-registered on likely approach routes. Air support is promised, weather permitting. Abrams studied the terrain with a critical eye. It's good ground for defense. Their most likely avenue of approach forces them to cross this open area, exposing their flanks if they try to deploy into battle formation. Precisely, and we'll have Sergeant Wallace's platoon positioned on the southern flank to exploit any such exposure. The 2 officers continued discussing tactical details as they walked back toward the command post, a camouflaged half-track positioned behind the ridgeline. Around them, the company bustled with purposeful activity as crews completed final preparations on their tanks, checking weapons, radios, and mechanical systems with the methodical thoroughness that came from months of combat experience. At the CP, Callahan gathered his officers for a final briefing. The men clustered around a map table, faces serious but composed as they reviewed the defensive plan one last time. The key is coordination, Callahan emphasized, tapping the map to indicate their positions. We engage according to the pre-planned sequence. Maintain disciplined fire, focusing on specific targets until they're neutralized. Remember the lessons from St. Martin. Target tracks, drive wheels, and turret mechanisms rather than attempting to penetrate main armor. Lieutenant Ross pointed to an area south of the town. Latest intelligence suggests they'll approach from this direction, using the tree line for concealment until they reach this point, which places them perfectly for our interlocking fire zones, Callahan confirmed. Artillery will open up when they reach this road junction, forcing them to either advance into our prepared positions or withdraw across exposed ground. The briefing continued for another 15 minutes, each officer reviewing their specific responsibilities within the overall plan. When they dispersed to their vehicles, Callahan sensed a quiet confidence among them. The apprehension about facing German heavy tanks remained, but it was tempered now by the knowledge that they had successfully engaged and defeated a King Tiger at St. Martin. What had once seemed nearly impossible now appeared merely extremely difficult. Callahan returned to Warhound 2, where his crew was completing their own preparations. Peterson had the engine access panels open, making final adjustments to the transmission that had been running hot during yesterday's operations. O'Malley and Rodriguez were inspecting the main gun, ensuring that the breech mechanism operated smoothly and that their stock of specialized APCR anti-tank rounds was properly stored for quick access. Barnes meticulously checked each radio frequency, confirming communication links with the other tanks and supporting units. "How's she running, Frank?" Callahan asked as he approached. Peterson closed an access panel before responding. "Better now. Adjusted the fan belt tension and cleaned out some debris from the cooling system. She should run cooler today." The veteran driver patted the hull affectionately. "This girl's going to perform when we need her." Callahan nodded, appreciating the mechanic's dedication. "Everyone else ready?" "All systems checked and operational, sir," Barnes reported. "Radio links confirmed with all elements in battalion headquarters. Gun sights calibrated and ammunition stowed," O'Malley added. 22 main gun rounds, including 8 APCR, plus full belts for both machine guns. Rodriguez simply nodded, his usual taciturn manner more pronounced before combat. The young loader had become increasingly quiet as the campaign progressed, but his performance remained impeccable. His powerful arms able to manhandle the heavy shells into the breech with remarkable speed even in the confines of the turret. "Good work, all of you," Callahan said, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "You know what we're facing today. Multiple King Tigers, supported by Panthers and infantry, the heaviest concentration of German armor we've encountered yet." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But we've faced these odds before and prevailed. We have better tanks now, proven tactics, and the advantage of fighting from prepared positions on ground of our choosing. Most importantly, we have each other. This crew, this company, has become one of the finest fighting units in the European theater. I couldn't ask for better men to face this challenge with." It wasn't Callahan's style to make grandiose speeches, and the men seemed almost embarrassed by this unusual display of sentiment from their normally reserved commander. But the words had their intended effect, strengthening the bonds that would sustain them through the coming battle. "Just another day at the office, Cap," Peterson said with a crooked smile, breaking the moment of awkward silence. "Exactly," Callahan agreed, grateful for the return to their normal professional rapport. "Mount up and move to your assigned position. Radio check at 0800. The company moved into its defensive positions with practiced efficiency, each tank finding natural concealment within its assigned sector while maintaining clear fields of fire toward the expected enemy approach routes. Callahan positioned Warhound 2 slightly behind the main line, on elevated ground that allowed him to observe and coordinate the entire company's actions. By 0900 hours, everything was in place. The artillery forward observer reported that his batteries were ready to fire on pre-registered targets. The air support liaison confirmed that a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts was standing by, weather conditions permitting their intervention. Infantry from the adjacent battalion had established supporting positions, their anti-tank teams equipped with bazookas positioned to cover potential blind spots in the tank's fields of fire. Now came the waiting, perhaps the most difficult part of any combat operation. The tense anticipation, knowing that powerful enemy forces were approaching but not yet visible, tested the nerves of even the most experienced soldiers. Movement at the edge of the tree line, southeastern approach, reported Lieutenant Parker over the company frequency at 0945. Vehicles visible, appears to be German reconnaissance elements. Callahan raised his binoculars, focusing on the indicated area. Through the morning haze, he could make out the distinctive silhouettes of German armored cars cautiously advancing along the road that led into Marigny from the southeast. All elements, hold fire, he ordered. Let their reconnaissance advance. We want their main force committed before we reveal our positions. For the next 30 minutes, they observed as German scout vehicles probed the approaches to Marigny, occasionally stopping to observe the surrounding terrain. The German reconnaissance was thorough but failed to detect the well-concealed American positions on the ridgeline west of the town. Main force approaching, Parker reported at 10:20. Count at least 15 armored vehicles in column formation on the main road. Lead elements appear to be Panthers, with heavier vehicles following. Callahan could now see them clearly through his binoculars. A formidable column of German armor, advancing with the confidence of a force that expected to encounter only token resistance. The Panthers led the formation, their sleek profiles distinctive even at this distance. Behind them came the massive King Tigers, their enormous hulls dwarfing the vehicles around them. Artillery liaison, initiate fire mission Alpha, Callahan ordered over the command frequency. All tank elements, prepare to engage on my command. Priority targets are the lead vehicles to immobilize the column on the road. Acknowledgements came back in terse professional responses. The company was ready, tension evident in the voices but controlled, channeled into focused preparation rather than paralyzing anxiety. Minutes later, the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery shells filled the air, followed by thunderous explosions as the pre-registered barrage landed precisely on the road junction where the German column was now concentrated. Dirt and smoke erupted skyward, temporarily obscuring the target area. When the dust began to clear, Callahan could see that the artillery had achieved its intended effect, disabling 2 vehicles and forcing the column to deploy prematurely. The German tanks began to fan out from the road, seeking better positions and attempting to identify the source of the artillery fire. Their movements were disciplined but hurried, commanders visibly concerned about being caught in the confined space of the road while under bombardment. All elements, commence firing, Callahan ordered as the German tanks reached their predetermined engagement line. Execute fire plan Bravo. The ridgeline erupted with the thunder of tank guns as Charlie Company opened fire simultaneously from multiple positions. The carefully planned fire distribution ensured that each German tank received concentrated attention from at least 2 American tanks, maximizing the effectiveness of their individually less powerful weapons. Through his binoculars, Callahan observed the initial impacts. Several hits were registered on Panthers, though it was difficult to assess damage at this range. The King Tigers appeared unharmed, their massive armor shrugging off hits that would have disabled lesser vehicles. Adjust fire to track mechanisms on the King Tigers, he ordered. Use APCR rounds for maximum penetration. The battle was now fully joined, with German tanks returning fire as they maneuvered to better positions. Their 88mm and 75mm guns had superior range and penetrating power, but the American tanks had the advantage of prepared positions with good hull-down concealment, presenting minimal target profiles to the enemy gunners. King Tiger at grid reference Delta 5 traversing toward Parker's position, Barnes reported, relaying information from the company net. 2 Panthers moving to supporting positions on its flanks. Warhound actual to all Baker elements. Shift fire to supporting Panthers, Callahan ordered. Charlie elements maintain focus on the King Tiger track mechanisms. The coordinated fire had its intended effect. 1 Panther was hit multiple times in rapid succession, black smoke beginning to pour from its engine compartment as its crew bailed out. The 2nd Panther was immobilized, a lucky shot from Lieutenant Ross's tank snapping a track link and leaving it stranded, but still able to return fire. The King Tiger, however, remained a formidable threat. Its massive 88mm gun fired, the shell impacting just meters from Parker's tank and showering it with dirt and debris. Only the hull-down position had saved the Sherman from a direct hit. O'Malley, target the King Tiger's right track assembly, Callahan directed. Peterson, adjust position 3 meters left for better firing angle. Target acquired, O'Malley confirmed, his voice steady as he peered through his gun sight. APCR loaded and ready. Fire when ready. The 76mm gun roared, its muzzle blast momentarily obscuring their vision. Through his binoculars, Callahan observed the round strike precisely where intended, at the vulnerable junction between the drive wheel and track. Metal fragments scattered from the impact point, but the track remained intact. Minimal effect, O'Malley reported, adjusting aim point. Before he could fire again, the King Tiger's turret swiveled toward their position, its long 88mm gun seeking them out with deadly purpose. "Incoming!" Peterson shouted, throwing the tank into reverse just as the German shell screamed overhead, impacting the ridge behind them with a thunderous explosion. "All elements concentrate fire on that King Tiger," Callahan ordered, his voice calm despite the near miss. The company responded immediately, multiple tanks shifting their fire to the German heavy tank. The air support liaison broke in on the command frequency. "Warhound Actual, this is Eagle 6, P-47's inbound, ETA 3 minutes. Request target designation. Eagle 6, priority targets are 3 King Tigers, vicinity grid square delta, marking with white phosphorus now." Callahan directed O'Malley to fire a white phosphorus round near the German heavies, creating a billowing white cloud to guide the incoming aircraft. The distinctive smoke would be clearly visible to the pilots, allowing them to identify the priority targets. The battle continued with undiminished intensity as they awaited the air support. German and American tanks exchanged fire across the rolling terrain, each side seeking advantage through maneuver and coordinated action. Charlie Company had lost 2 tanks thus far, both standard Shermans hit by direct fire from Panthers. One crew had escaped unharmed. The status of the second remained unknown. The distinctive rumble of aircraft engines announced the arrival of the P-47 Thunderbolts, their silhouettes visible against the blue sky as they dove toward the battlefield. The ground attack fighters streaked in at low altitude, their 850 caliber machine guns chattering as they strafed German positions. Then came the heavier thump of bombs releasing, followed by spectacular explosions as 500-pound bombs impacted among the German armor. When the smoke cleared, one King Tiger lay on its side, thrown over by a near-direct hit. Another was clearly damaged but still operational, smoke pouring from damaged engine compartments, but its guns still firing. The third appeared largely unaffected, its thick armor having protected it from all but the closest explosions. "Airstrike has neutralized one King Tiger, damaged another," Callahan reported to battalion, continuing engagement with remaining enemy armor. The tide of battle had shifted perceptibly with the air attack. The German advance, already slowed by the artillery and tank fire, now faltered as commanders reassessed the situation. Several Panthers began moving laterally, seeking better positions or perhaps preparing for a withdrawal. "They're losing cohesion," Lieutenant Ross observed over the command frequency, shifting to individual tank actions rather than coordinated movement. "Maintain pressure," Callahan ordered. "Target remaining operational vehicles in sequence, starting with command tanks." For the next 30 minutes, the battle devolved into a series of intense individual engagements as the German force gradually disintegrated under the combined pressure of air, artillery, and armor attacks. The remaining King Tiger proved remarkably resilient, absorbing multiple hits while continuing to return deadly accurate fire that destroyed another of Charlie Company's Shermans. "We need to neutralize that last King Tiger," Callahan said to his crew. "It's preventing us from exploiting their disorganization." "Sir, I have an idea," Barnes said from his radio position. "The drainage ditch on the eastern edge of the field. It runs behind their current position. If we could get a tank into that ditch, we might approach from their blind spot." Callahan studied the terrain through his binoculars. The young radio operator was right. The drainage feature was deep enough to conceal a tank, and it curved around behind the current German position. "Good thinking, Barnes. Wallace, this is Warhound Actual. Move your platoon south to grid reference Echo 7. There's a drainage feature there that will allow covered approach to the rear of the King Tiger position." "Roger that, Captain. Moving now." As Wallace's platoon, comprising 2 EZ-8s and 1 standard Sherman, began their flanking maneuver, Callahan directed the remainder of the company to increase fire on the German positions, keeping their attention focused forward. 20 tense minutes followed as Wallace's platoon disappeared from view, using the terrain feature to approach the German flank unseen. Callahan maintained steady pressure on the German positions, coordinating artillery support to further fix their attention toward the American main body. "In position," Wallace reported finally. "Have visual on King Tiger rear aspect. Range 300 yards and closing." "Execute when ready," Callahan ordered. "All elements prepare to advance on my command once the King Tiger is neutralized." Through his binoculars, Callahan saw the muzzle flashes as Wallace's tanks opened fire from their concealed position. The King Tiger, caught completely by surprise, took multiple hits to its rear armor and engine compartment before it could react. Black smoke billowed from the massive vehicle, followed by flames that quickly engulfed the engine section. King Tiger neutralized, Wallace reported, the satisfaction evident in his voice despite his professional tone. Crew abandoning vehicle, 2 Panthers still operational in vicinity, engaging now. All elements, advance, Callahan ordered, sensing the moment had come to press their advantage. Parker, take the left flank. Ross, center with me. Wallace will continue pressure from the right. Charlie companies surged forward from their defensive positions, advancing toward the now disorganized German force with newfound aggression. The remaining German tanks, deprived of the King Tiger's heavy firepower and facing attacks from multiple directions, began a fighting withdrawal toward the southeast. By mid-afternoon, the battle for Marini was effectively over. The German armored thrust had been decisively defeated, with 2 King Tigers and 7 Panthers destroyed or captured. The remaining German forces had withdrawn, abandoning their attempt to retake the strategic crossroads town. Charlie Company had paid a price for this victory. 4 Shermans destroyed, 3 men killed, and 7 wounded. But considering the disparate forces involved, the outcome represented a remarkable achievement, a testament to the effectiveness of their tactics and the skill of their crews. As Callahan supervised the consolidation of their position and the evacuation of the wounded, Lieutenant Colonel Abrams arrived at the forward command post, his expression revealing both satisfaction and somber recognition of the cost. Exceptional work, Captain, Abrams said, surveying the battlefield where the massive hulks of destroyed German tanks stood as mute testimony to the day's combat. Division is already calling this a significant victory. The German counterattack in this sector has been completely disrupted. Thank you, sir. The men performed admirably. Callahan's voice carried the weariness that always followed the intense concentration of combat. The air support was crucial, as was the artillery coordination. True, but it was your tactical approach that made the difference. The flanking maneuver at the end was particularly well executed. Callahan nodded toward the command half-track where Barnes was coordinating radio traffic. Credit for that goes to my radio operator. He identified the terrain feature that made it possible. Abrams studied the young soldier with newfound appreciation. Initiative at all levels. That's what gives us the edge, despite the technical disparities. He turned back to Callahan. I've received authorization to accelerate the Thunderbolt program based on today's results. Every Sherman in the ETO will be upgraded to the EZ-8 configuration as rapidly as production allows. It was welcome news, though Callahan knew it would come too late for many crews still fighting in standard Shermans. War rarely synchronized its timelines with production schedules. What about the Pershing, sir? Is it still in development? Absolutely. Today's engagement confirmed what we already suspected. The EZ-8 is a significant improvement, but we still need a heavier tank with better armor protection and a more powerful gun for direct engagements with German heavies. Abrams gestured toward the destroyed King Tiger. But until the Pershing arrives in numbers, we'll fight with what we have, using the tactics you've helped develop. As night fell over the battlefield, Callahan returned to Warhound 2, where his crew was performing post-combat maintenance. The EZ-8 had performed admirably throughout the engagement, absorbing one glancing hit without serious damage and maintaining full mobility despite the punishing cross-country movement. How's she looking? He asked Peterson, who was inspecting the track tension by flashlight. No major issues, Cap. Suspension took a beating during that final advance, but the improved system handled it well. We'll need to replace a few track pins tomorrow, but nothing that will keep us out of action. Callahan nodded, patting the hull of the tank that had carried them through yet another deadly engagement. Get some rest when you can. Battalion says we're moving out at 0600 tomorrow. The Germans are falling back across the entire sector, and we're ordered to maintain pressure on their withdrawal. The war would continue, pushing eastward toward Germany itself. There would be more battles, more engagements with German heavy armor, more tests of their tactics and equipment. But Charlie Company had proven that American tankers, despite their technical disadvantages, could prevail through superior tactics, coordination, and the resourcefulness that came from their diverse civilian backgrounds. As Callahan performed his final inspection of the company's position before seeking a few hours of sleep, he reflected on how far they had come since the desperate days following D-Day. They had learned, adapted, and overcome challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. Whatever lay ahead, he had confidence that they would face it with the same determination and skill they had displayed at Marigny. The moon rose over the Norman countryside, illuminating the battlefield in pale silver light. The silhouettes of tanks, both American and German, stood in mute testimony to the day's combat, steel sentinels marking another step in the long road toward victory. Chapter 10. Return to the present. The afternoon sun had shifted during Robert Callahan's telling, casting different shadows across the Sherman tank that stood before them in the Patent Armor Museum. His grandson Michael sat transfixed, having barely moved during the entire narrative. "So that's how you beat the King Tigers?" the boy asked, his voice hushed with newfound appreciation for both his grandfather and the olive-drab machine that had carried him through those harrowing days in Normandy. Callahan nodded slowly. "That was one battle of many. We faced more German heavy tanks as we pushed toward Germany. Each engagement taught us something new, forced us to adapt our tactics. By the time we crossed the Rhine, we had the experience and the improved tanks to meet them on more equal terms." He reached out again to touch the Sherman's hull, his weathered hand resting on the steel surface with a familiarity born of countless hours spent living and fighting within a nearly identical machine. The history books focus on the technical specifications, the armor thickness and gun calibers. They'll tell you the Sherman was outclassed by the German heavies, and they're not wrong about the numbers. His pale blue eyes, still sharp despite his 75 years, met his grandson's. But they missed the human element. The Sherman was reliable, adaptable, and we had thousands of them. Most importantly, they were crewed by men who refused to accept that they were outmatched, men who found ways to overcome the disadvantages through innovation, teamwork, and sheer determination. Michael studied the tank with new eyes, seeing beyond the static museum piece to the fighting vehicle his grandfather had described. "What happened to your crew, Peterson and O'Malley and the others?" A smile softened Callahan's features. "They all made it through, though not without their shares of close calls. Peterson went back to Detroit after the war, worked for the auto industry, using the mechanical skills he'd honed keeping our tank running. O'Malley returned to the Chicago police force, eventually becoming a detective. Rodriguez used the GI Bill to attend college, the first in his family to do so. And Barnes, our brilliant youngster, went back to MIT and eventually worked on the space program." "You stayed in touch with them?" "All our lives," Callahan confirmed. "We've gathered every year on the anniversary of D-Day. The numbers have dwindled as age has taken its toll, but the bonds formed in combat never truly break." The museum docent who had spoken with them earlier approached once more, his expression indicating he had overheard at least part of Callahan's story. "Sir, I hope I'm not intruding, but I couldn't help noticing your connection to this particular Sherman. Would you be willing to share some of your experiences with our historical documentation project? First-hand accounts from tank commanders are incredibly valuable to preserving the accurate history of armored warfare." Callahan considered the request thoughtfully. For decades, he had kept many of his war experiences private, sharing them only with fellow veterans who had lived through similar circumstances. But as the years passed and the ranks of World War II veterans thinned, he had come to recognize the importance of ensuring that future generations understood not just the technical aspects of the conflict, but the human dimensions as well. "I believe I would," he said finally. "There are perspectives that only those who lived it can provide. Lessons about adaptation, innovation, and overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds that remain relevant today." The docent's face lit up. "That's wonderful, sir. We can arrange everything at your convenience. Your insights will be an invaluable addition to our archives." As the man departed to make the necessary arrangements, Michael looked up at his grandfather with newfound respect. "Why haven't you ever told these stories before? To the family, I mean." Callahan sighed, his gaze returning to the Sherman. "War stories are complicated, Michael. There's the glory and the camaraderie, yes, but also the loss, the fear, the moments where survival came down to nothing more than blind luck. For a long time, it seemed better to focus on the life I built after the war rather than the experiences that shaped me during it." He placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "But perhaps that was a mistake. There are lessons in those experiences that shouldn't be lost. About facing seemingly impossible challenges, about finding solutions when none appear to exist, about the strength that comes from trusting and depending on others." Michael nodded solemnly, understanding that his grandfather had shared something precious with him, a perspective on history that no textbook could provide. Thank you for telling me, Grandpa. Callahan smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. Thank you for asking the right questions. Sometimes that's all it takes to bring the past to life again. As they prepared to continue their tour of the museum, Michael paused for one last look at the Sherman. It doesn't look that impressive compared to the Tiger they have in the next hall. No, it doesn't, Callahan agreed. And that's precisely the point. History isn't always made by the biggest or the most powerful. Sometimes it's shaped by those who refuse to accept the limitations others would impose on them, who find ways to succeed despite the odds. He guided his grandson toward the next exhibit, but not before casting one final glance back at the Sherman. In his mind's eye, he could still see Warhound 2 advancing across the Norman countryside, could still feel the vibration of the engine and hear the voices of his crew over the intercom. The tank had been more than just a machine. It had been their home, their protection, and ultimately, the vehicle that had carried them through some of history's most pivotal moments. The lessons of those desperate days in 19 when American tankers faced superior German armor with inferior equipment but refused to concede defeat remained as relevant in the present as they had been then. Adaptation, innovation, teamwork, and unyielding determination could overcome even the most daunting technological disadvantages. It was a legacy worth preserving, not just in museums and history books, but in the living memory passed from one generation to the next. As Callahan and his grandson moved on to the next exhibit, the afternoon sun continued its journey across the sky, its light touching the Sherman's hull one last time before moving on. Just as history itself had moved on, carrying the lessons of the past into the ever-unfolding future. Chapter 11, Legacy of Steel. 3 months after their visit to the Patent Armor Museum, Robert Callahan returned, this time accompanied not only by his grandson Michael, but by a film crew from the museum's historical documentation project. The oral history interview had expanded into a more comprehensive documentary when the museum staff realized the value of Callahan's unique perspective as both a combat tank commander and a participant in the Thunderbolt program that had helped shape American armor doctrine. They had set up their equipment beside the Sherman exhibit, positioning Callahan so that the tank formed a backdrop to his interview. The project director, a military historian named Dr. Eleanor Martinez, had spent weeks researching the specific battles Callahan had described, correlating his recollections with official after-action reports and German records that had been captured after the war. Your account of the engagement at Marini matches remarkably well with both American and captured German records, she told Callahan, as the crew made final lighting adjustments. The German after-action report specifically mentions the effectiveness of the flanking maneuver that neutralized their last operational King Tiger. Callahan nodded, pleased that his memories had been validated by the historical record. The credit belongs to Barnes, my radio operator. He identified the terrain feature that made the maneuver possible. We've also located some of the official reports you filed as part of the Thunderbolt program, Martinez continued. Your technical assessments of the EZ-8's performance were remarkably detailed. Several of your recommendations were implemented in the final production models. I had an excellent crew, Callahan replied modestly. Peterson could tell you more about a tank's mechanical systems from listening to the engine than most technicians could from a complete teardown. As they prepared to begin the formal interview, Michael approached with an elderly gentleman Callahan didn't immediately recognize. Grandpa, look who I found in the visitor center, the boy said excitedly. He says he knows you. The man stepped forward, his movements slowed by age but still carrying himself with a certain dignity. Hello, Bob. It's been a while. Recognition dawned in Callahan's eyes as he took in the familiar features beneath the changes wrought by decades. Timothy? Timothy Barnes? The former radio operator grinned. The one and only. When my granddaughter saw the museum's announcement about your interview, I knew I had to come. It's been, 5 years since the last reunion? Callahan embraced his former crewman, emotion momentarily overcoming his usual reserve. At least that. I wasn't sure you'd be able to travel anymore after your hip surgery. Takes more than a new hip to keep me grounded, Barnes replied, especially for something this important. Dr. Martinez had observed this reunion with obvious interest. Mr. Barnes, would you be willing to participate in the interview as well? Having two perspectives from the same tank crew would be incredibly valuable. Barnes looked to Callahan, who nodded encouragement. I'd be honored, the former radio operator replied. Though I should warn you, my memory isn't what it once was. Between the two of us, we should be able to piece it together, Callahan assured him. The museum staff quickly adjusted their setup to accommodate a second interviewee, positioning Barnes beside Callahan, with the Sherman still framed behind them. Michael watched with fascination as the two elderly veterans settled into their chairs, occasionally exchanging quiet remarks that seemed to transport them back across the decades to their shared experiences. When the cameras began rolling, Dr. Martinez started with basic questions about their backgrounds and training before focusing on their experiences with the Sherman tank in combat. The Sherman has often been criticized as inferior to German tanks like the Panther and Tiger, she noted. How did you and your fellow tankers perceive this disparity at the time? Callahan considered the question carefully before responding. We were acutely aware of it. You couldn't face a Panther or Tiger in combat without recognizing the technical advantages they held, particularly in terms of armor protection and gun penetration capability. Barnes nodded agreement. The first time we saw a Tiger up close, it was like looking at a prehistoric monster compared to our Sherman. The sheer size difference was intimidating. But, Callahan continued, we also understood that war isn't simply a matter of comparing technical specifications. The Sherman had advantages of its own, particularly in reliability, ease of maintenance, and tactical mobility. And we had them in far greater numbers than the Germans had their heavy tanks. Perhaps most importantly, Barnes added, we developed tactics that minimized our vulnerabilities while exploiting theirs. The Wolfpack approach that Captain Callahan implemented allowed us to overcome the one-on-one disadvantage through coordinated action. The interview continued, with both veterans providing insights into not just the technical aspects of tank warfare, but the human experiences of living and fighting in the confines of a Sherman. They described the cramped conditions, the bone-jarring rides across rough terrain, the terrifying moments when enemy shells struck nearby, and the precious camaraderie that sustained them through the worst days of combat. There's a perspective that's often missing from historical accounts, Callahan explained at one point. The Sherman wasn't just a collection of armor plates and mechanical systems. It was a home for 5 men who depended on each other for their survival. We knew every inch of that tank, every sound it made, every quirk in its performance. That intimacy with our equipment gave us advantages that technical specifications can't quantify. Barnes described the innovations that crews developed to improve their chances of survival, from adding sandbags for additional protection to modifying ammunition storage to reduce fire risks. We were constantly adapting, finding ways to make the Sherman more effective despite its limitations. As the interview progressed, Dr. Martinez directed the conversation toward the Thunderbolt program and the introduction of the EZ-8 variant. The improvements were significant, Callahan explained. The HVSS suspension system greatly enhanced cross-country mobility and stability when firing on the move. The wet ammunition storage substantially reduced the risk of catastrophic fires when hit. And while the 76mm guns still struggled against the frontal armor of German heavy tanks, it gave us a fighting chance against their flanks and rear aspects. But the technological improvements were only part of the story, Barnes added. What really made the difference was how we integrated these improved tanks into our tactical approach. The EZ-8s took the point positions, using their enhanced capabilities to lead flanking maneuvers, while the standard Shermans provided supporting fire. The interview extended well beyond its scheduled time as the veterans shared detailed accounts of specific engagements, technical assessments of various Sherman modifications, and personal anecdotes that brought the historical events to life with remarkable immediacy. Throughout it all, Michael sat just off camera, absorbing every word, occasionally exchanging glances with his grandfather when particularly significant points were made. When the formal interview finally concluded, Dr. Martinez thanked both men for their invaluable contributions. Your perspectives will help ensure that future generations understand not just what happened during these pivotal battles, but how it felt to be there, making critical decisions under the most challenging circumstances. As the crew began packing their equipment, Callahan and Barnes walked slowly to the Sherman exhibit, studying the restored tank with the critical eyes of men who had once depended on an identical machine for their survival. They've done a good job with the restoration, Barnes observed. Even got the little details right, like the placement of the intercom boxes and the gunner's sight adjustments. Callahan nodded agreement. But there are things they could never recreate. The smell of 5 men living in that metal box for days on end. The way the whole tank shuddered when the main gun fired. The constant background noise of the engine that you stopped, consciously hearing after a while, but immediately noticed when it changed pitch. I still dream about it sometimes, Barnes admitted. Find myself back in that radio operator's position, trying to maintain communications while shells are falling all around us. Me too, Callahan said softly. But in my dreams, I'm always worried about the crew, about making the right decisions to keep them alive. Barnes placed a hand on his former commander's shoulder. You did, Bob. You made the right calls when it mattered most. That's why we're standing here today when so many others aren't. Michael approached cautiously, sensing the emotional weight of the moment between the two veterans. Mr. Barnes was telling me about the time you had to drive through a flooded river because the bridge was destroyed, he said to his grandfather. Callahan smiled, the tension of the moment broken by his grandson's enthusiasm. That was Peterson's doing more than mine. He had an almost supernatural ability to judge what terrain the tank could handle, drove through water up to the turret ring, while the rest of the company was looking for an alternate crossing miles away. The three of them continued sharing stories as they walked through the museum, the two veterans pointing out details in various exhibits that only those with first-hand experience would notice. For Michael, it was an education beyond anything available in textbooks, a living connection to a history that had shaped the world he inhabited. Later, as they prepared to depart, Dr. Martinez approached with a folder of documents. We found something in the archives I thought you might want to see, she said, handing the folder to Callahan. It's a copy of the final Thunderbolt program assessment submitted to Ordnance Branch in September 1944. Your reports are cited extensively, particularly regarding the tactical deployment of the EZ-8. Callahan opened the folder, finding a yellow document bearing the Army's official letterhead and marked confidential in red stamps across the top. As he scanned the pages, he found multiple references to Captain Callahan's innovative tactical approach and combat-validated improvements recommended by frontline commanders. They actually listened, he said with mild surprise. All those reports we filed, the detailed assessments after each engagement. I sometimes wondered if they just disappeared into some headquarters filing cabinet. On the contrary, Martinez assured him, your observations directly influenced not only the final production specifications for the M4A3E8, but also early development work on what would become the M26 Pershing and eventually the entire lineage of American main battle tanks leading to today's M1 Abrams. She gestured toward a display at the far end of the hall where an M1 Abrams stood in desert camouflage, its massive 100 mm gun and sophisticated composite armor representing the culmination of decades of tank development. There's a direct line from your experiences in Normandy to that machine, she said. The lessons learned by you and other Sherman commanders echo through generations of American tank design. The emphasis on crew survivability, mechanical reliability, and tactical mobility that characterizes American armor doctrine can be traced directly back to the hard-won insights gained during those critical months in 1944. Callahan studied the modern tank thoughtfully. We could have only dreamed of such a machine. The ability to hit targets accurately while moving at speed, thermal imaging sights, armor that it can withstand multiple hits from enemy tanks. Yet the fundamentals remain the same, Barnes observed. It's still a team of men inside an armored box, facing the chaos of combat together, depending on each other's skills and courage to accomplish their mission and return home safely. As they finally departed the museum, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, not unlike the shadows that had stretched across the Norman countryside on those distant summer evenings in 1944. Michael walked between his grandfather and Barnes, listening intently as they continued to share memories and insights from their shared experiences. For Callahan, the day had brought a sense of completion, a feeling that the circle had somehow closed. The lessons he and his crew had learned through blood and fire on the fields of France had not been lost to history, but had been preserved, analyzed, and incorporated into the continuing evolution of American armored warfare. Their experiences, their innovations, their sacrifices had meaning beyond the immediate objective of defeating the German forces they faced. The legacy of those desperate days lived on, not just in museums and historical records, but in the design philosophy of modern tanks, in the tactical doctrine taught to new generations of armored warfare specialists, and most importantly, in the personal connections that link past to present through the sharing of hard-won wisdom. As he watched his grandson absorb these lessons with eager enthusiasm, Callahan felt a profound gratitude for the opportunity to serve as that living link between generations, ensuring that the truths he and his comrades had discovered about overcoming seemingly insurmountable challenges would endure long after the last Sherman commander had departed the field of battle. The Sherman tank they had left behind in the museum would continue to stand as a silent witness to history, its battered armor telling part of the story. But the full truth of those pivotal days could only be found in the human experience, in the courage, innovation, and unyielding determination of the men who had refused to accept defeat even when facing superior forces with inferior equipment. That was the true legacy of steel, not just the metal forged into tanks and guns, but the unbending resolve of the human spirit that ultimately determined the outcome of battles, campaigns, and wars. It was a legacy worth preserving, worth sharing, worth carrying forward into an uncertain future that would undoubtedly present new challenges requiring the same resourcefulness and courage that had seen them through their darkest hours. "Ready to head home?" Callahan asked his grandson as they reached the car. Michael nodded, though his expression suggested his mind was still processing everything he had heard and seen. "Grandpa, do you think I could join in the Army someday? Maybe even the armor branch?" Callahan exchanged a glance with Barnes, a lifetime of shared experiences passing between them in that brief moment. "If that's what you decide, I'd be proud," he answered honestly. "But remember what you learned today. The most powerful weapon in any arsenal isn't the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It's the human capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to persevere against overwhelming odds. That's the real lesson of the Sherman, and it applies to far more than just warfare." As they drove away from the museum, the silhouette of the Sherman tank remained visible through the rear window, standing as it had for decades, a testament to an era when ordinary Americans had faced extraordinary challenges and discovered within themselves the resources to prevail against all odds.